Go home. Go back to where you came from. Oh, look at that bomb bag lady. Why do you wear that thing on your head? Did your husband make you do that? Your Honor, she follows Sharia law. How are you going to ensure that your children will not become terrorists? Can you please remove that scarf? We need to search you. Hands on the wall. Ma'am, your 7-year-old child is on our list. Please step aside. These are just a few of the comments and experiences that I have personally endured as an American Muslim woman post 9/11. Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. My name is Arshia Ali Khan, and it is my honor to be serving as the Interim Chief Executive Officer of the Muslim Legal Fund of America since June of 2020. On behalf of our Board of Directors and our staff, I welcome you today to our 20th Anniversary Symposium, Citizens on Probation. The Muslim Legal Fund of America was founded in 2001 by a coalition of civil rights activists seeking to readdress systemic discrimination against American Muslims in the dawn of 9/11. 9/11 had yet again changed America for all Americans, changed how Muslims are perceived around the globe. For American Muslims, home felt like anything but home. We were reminded again that our Constitution was not for all. Our laws were changed, and our American values that are at the foundation of our nation's strength and security once again became exclusive. Our government engaged in systemic policies of indefinite detention, warrantless and mass surveillance, racial, religious, and other forms of profiling and discrimination that still, 20 years later, remain at the core elements of our US national security strategy. Our laws, our values were eroded, and suddenly, yet again, not everyone belonged. We were reminded again that not everyone in America is American enough to be American, to feel safe in America. For 2 decades, our track record spoke for itself. We intentionally stayed behind the scenes as we welcomed cases that no one wanted to touch. MLFA's responsibility was to continue to step forward with courage when everyone else stepped out. We have raised over $25 million to date to secure the highest quality of legal representation for individuals facing adverse immigration, civil, and criminal challenges in the guise of national security. We opened our legal fund for imams, for community leaders, for activists, for organizations, or for any American Muslim the community believed was being treated unfairly by our legal system. Unlike nations across the globe, we here in the United States of America have the ability to influence our government, to set precedents, to fight the good fight. Change takes time, but ignorance is not an excuse. We have a collective responsibility to the world to stand tall and to stand against any and all injustices that our brothers and sisters are facing all day, every day. We know that we must strategically respond with continued courage, not just react with hurt and anger. And that is what we are doing here at the Muslim Legal Fund of America. Our mission was redefined in 2019 is to advance equality and justice for American Muslims and Muslim organizations by promoting legal compliance and protecting their rights in matters concerning national security law. So once again, I thank you for joining us today. We are live across multiple social media channels and Aljazeera Mubasher. I thank you again for joining us, and please, at this moment, allow me to welcome and introduce Dr. Hathambasian, Interim Board Chair of the Muslim Legal Fund of America, a distinguished scholar, author, activist, and leading authority Islamophobia, to share his opening remarks with us. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Arshia, for the introduction. Let me first thank our staff, our volunteers, our board, and our speakers who accepted our invitation to engage in a conversation with us on the theme of citizens on probation, which is the theme of how Muslims are treated, both in the United States, I would say, and in many different locations around the world. Meaning our citizenship is not equal. We're not treated equally at the court in the legal domain. We're not treated equally in civil society. And Muslim communities across the country are expressing the feelings that they have by various surveys that can give us an indication of where we are. In a recent survey that we have conducted, some 80% of the respondents, this is a survey of 1,614 individuals, 80% of the respondents said that they feel either strongly insecure or somewhat insecure for their family and kids. This was one of the most shocking findings from the survey. Normally, you will get in the 5 to 10 percentile of individuals that would respond as such. But to see such a drastic expression of individuals saying that they feel insecure. More importantly, that across many areas, Muslim women find themselves at the intersection of both discrimination and violence, in particular Muslim women who wear the headscarf, but also Muslim women in the workplace feel unsupported, feel that they are demonized, and constantly engage both either that they are perceived to be oppressed, a whole long-term Orientalist trope, or that they are also being seen as object of exotic engagement. So this is a serious element relative to Muslim women. In some other studies that we have done, many Muslim women in public space are actually gets assaulted, often by men. But yet we don't see the society come to their rescue. When we speak about the broader term of Islamophobia, Muslims face prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, and violence. MLFA's work is so critical. We see ourselves as the main organization that works in the area of national security. We take the cases that involve some element of government intrusion and some element of government targeting of the Muslim community in relations to issues of terrorism. If you ask Muslims, they will actually inform you that they are familiar with the concept of government entrapment. They're familiar of preemptive prosecution. And for sure, many are familiar with material support. These are the cluster of legal cases that have been thrown at Muslim communities across the country. So Muslims, in similar way to other communities of color, and I think in here, our Black brothers and sisters across this nation, the civil rights and human rights discourse have been written on their bodies and in their experiences on a daily basis. And not to exceptionalize the Muslim narrative, America has a long, complex, entangled history with communities of color, the Black community, indigenous communities, the Chinese community, Japanese, and so on. So as we are attempting to rewrite the wrongs, to defend ourselves in the court and to defend ourselves in civil society, we seek to do it in partnership, that to lift all those who have been marginalized and have been violated by our legal system. And I always say in my classroom that the primary violator of the human and civil rights of communities have been the policies of government. And as we challenge it in the court and in the policy arena, our collective hope that we will make America better. I am for commitment to partner and to engage in strengthening the Muslim community through partnership, through collective effort to make our society a much more fairer, equal domain for everyone to actualize their future horizon. So thank you for being with us and look forward to our continued work collectively. Assalamu alaikum.
Just need to unmute, sorry.
My apologies. Let me start that again. Dr. Bazian, thank you so much for being in partnership with me. You reminded us again that ours is not a caravan of despair. So inshallah, with that, I'd like to welcome a Chicago Sun-Times contributing columnist, political analyst of ABC7, Chicago's ABC-owned station, a visiting fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, an award-winning nonprofit professional and multimedia journalist, Laura Washington. Laura specializes in African American affairs, local and national politics, race and racism, and social justice. Her column has been published by Chicago Sun-Times since 2001. She is a commentator on National Public Radio and Chicago Public Radio. We are so honored to have you with us today to moderate the symposium. Thank you, Laura. It has been such a pleasure to get to know you over the past few weeks, and I'm honored and grateful to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Arshia. It's the same here, and I really appreciate that warm introduction. And thank you, Dr. Bazian, for your very important remarks as well. I'm really honored to be with you today. In my own career, I'm also honored to have served as the Ida B. Wells Barnett University professor at DePaul University. And like Ida B. Wells, I have fashioned my work around race and the fight for race and social justice. I've done my reporting in what may be America's most segregated and racially divided city. As we begin today, I think about the through line of injustice and oppression in our history. I think about Ida B. Wells and her reporting to expose the murders of hundreds of Black men by lynching in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think about the Chicago race riots of 1919, when dozens of Black lives were lost and hundreds more were injured. I think about the lynching and murder of Emmett Till in 1955, that boy from Chicago who was viciously murdered during a summer visit in Mississippi. And of course, we all think about the horrific murder of George Floyd. In that through line, there are many painful parallels to the last 20 years of oppression, discrimination, and mistreatment of Muslims in America. We know that we have a fight to end that, and that fight is what we're going to explore today. But we all share that mission and obligation for change. This is America. In America, Black lives matter and Muslim lives must matter. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "No one is free until we are all free." That is the work of MLFA, and is why it's so important and crucial and life-saving. So today we've assembled an all-star lineup of civil rights experts, advocates, and allies to explore what's ahead. And we want to tell you how you can help MLFA continue its mission to educate, empower, and change. We will hear from two esteemed speakers who will offer keynotes to lay the groundwork for this discussion. And they will be followed by two stellar panels who will continue the conversation. There will also be an opportunity to hear from you during the Q&A period. So please begin to think about the questions and concerns that you want to share. And you can do so on either your Facebook page or on your YouTube page in the comments section. Staff will be gathering your comments throughout the program and be sharing them with us so that we can get to as many questions as we can. So I really look forward to that conversation. And now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Professor John Powell for our first keynote presentation. John A. Powell is a director of Othering and Belonging Institute at the UC Berkeley, and he is also the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. He also serves as a professor of law, African American studies, and ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. Professor Powell is an internationally recognized expert in civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. At the Othering and Belonging Institute, he brings together scholars, community activists, communicators, and policymakers to identify and eliminate the barriers to inclusive, just, and sustainable societies, and to create transformative change toward a more equitable world. Among his many other achievements, he is the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. John A. Powell, welcome.
Thank you, Laura. It's a delight to be here with you. And it's really important work. And I just want to comment that, first of all, the work that you're doing at MLFA is not just actually trying to help America, help the United States become a place of belonging for Muslims, but really to live up to the highest principles of the United States. In a sense, I would say the work you're doing is the work of real patriots, because unlike many people, you embrace the full breadth of the American promise and dream. I want to talk about that a little bit. Also want to acknowledge, though, my incredible staff. We have a global justice program, and in that program, we have a project on Islamophobia, where El Sadiq, Sarah, and others did one of the first major surveys of Muslims as to their experience in life in the United States as Muslims. There have been many more surveys about how people who are not Muslims feel about Muslims, but this is one of the first that looked in depth of the Muslim experience itself. The United States is sort of a country, maybe like most, but built on contradictions. We all know the Declaration of Independence, that famous phrase that all men, we need to correct that, all people are created equal, that we hold these truths self-evident. We hold these truths self-evident. No proof necessary. You're not on probation. Everyone is of equal value. Now, the author of that was, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who had more than 200 slaves. So there lies the contradiction. And that contradiction has haunted the United States from its inception to the day. The first Immigration Act passed by the United States in 1790 was explicit of limiting those who could be naturalized to white males, actually to whites, but in practice it was white male property owners. It went even further. Up until the 1960s, many of the leaders of this country were clear that this was not only a white Christian country, it was a white Protestant country. I'm old enough to remember when John F. Kennedy was running for president, and the question was, could a Catholic really be president? We now have a second Catholic as president. But it was very controversial because the assumption was only certain people belong. Now, it's interesting because that contradiction of excluding people, of enslaving people, of stealing land was there even while there was the promise of equality and fairness and inclusion for all. So there's always been two main stories in America, one of control and domination by a few of the many, and one of inclusion. And at least rhetorically now, the country actually embraces the latter, that everyone is of equal value. Unfortunately, that has not been the case in practice for many groups, as Laura just pointed out, and it continues not to be the practice. And with 9/11, 2001, the focus on the designated other, to some extent, either expanded or shifted from African Americans to Muslims. There were many things that happened as a result of 9/11. First of all, millions of people were painted with a brush of what a few people had done. Think about the United States. There's been terrorism in the United States as long as there's been a country. We all know of the Oklahoma bombing, which killed over 200 people. But that wasn't used to actually question the religious faith of the bomber. It was seen as a lone wolf. But when Muslims are associated in any way with threats, then all Muslims, and the more than 3 million Muslims who live in the United States, are tainted with that threat. And part of that is not simply the act of those individuals, but part of it is American concept of itself, the concept of who belong and who does not belong, the assumption that certain people don't belong, or if they do belong, they're on probation. They have to perform a certain way. They have to behave a certain way, while other people's sense of belonging, sense of citizenship, if you will, or membership is self-evident. We don't have to question it. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Institute. We're at UC Berkeley, and we have about 130 faculty affiliates, and we have a staff of over 60, and we're organized across different clusters and different issues. We deal with race, we deal with religion, we have one of our clusters that's focusing on religion, we deal with LGBTQ, we deal with disability, and others. But one way of thinking about understanding the Institute is its name itself. We are concerned with making that American promise real, where all people belong, all people. Not all people, but all people. And so we talk about belonging without othering. How do we create a society and indeed a world where it's clear that all people belong? Not provisionally, not on probation, not if they behave. That's the nature of being human in the world today. And so we talk about belonging without othering. Most of the way people constitute themselves, constitute their groups, is that they say this small group belong and everyone else is outside of that belonging, or they can only come in if they behave. Some conservatives have argued that the United States should not be ashamed of saying that the country was not an immigrant country. The country was a settler country, and that the settlers created a template which everyone else needs to adhere to. They argue that that template is white. Actually, they don't say white anymore. That's out of favor, although in the last 5 or 6 years it's coming back. But they would say Protestant, English speaking, people of Christian faith, people with certain values. And again, they might say white. They're saying that that's the template, and that in order to belong, in order to become part of this incredible country, you have to adhere to the values associated with that. The immigrant ideal of America is that people have come from all over the world, and each time they come, they contribute to not only the country, they contribute to redefining what those values actually mean. What does freedom and equality mean? Fortunately for us, again, the constitutions and many of our founding documents are clear that it's the latter, that the country is not simply a country of settlers. It's a country of immigrants. It's a country of people coming here, notwithstanding Native Americans already being here, notwithstanding that African Americans didn't come as immigrants, but it's a country where different groups come and participate and co-create this country. And that's really the goal of the Institute. Like MLFA, we are also, in a sense, patriots in the best sense of the words. We're trying to get America to live up to its best values. Now, since 9/11, and more recently under President Trump, this country has not been living up to those values. We had registries. We had banning people from Muslim countries, things that was, in a sense, unthinkable when you think about Americans' values. And yet, because of fear, because of the sense that some people are different than other people, they don't belong, not only was that allowed, to some extent, it was very popular. We see people's religious rights being trampled. Can you imagine someone saying, you can come to this country, but you can't practice the Jewish faith? You can't practice your Christian faith. You can't practice your Buddhist faith. The heart of the founding of this country was to note that this country would be a place where religious freedom would be real. And that's actually enshrined, not just in speeches, on papers. That is what the heart of the First Amendment is about. Some people think of First Amendment just in terms of free speech, and that's there too. But religious freedom is the heart of the First Amendment. And some people say it's first because in some ways it's maybe the most important. And yet, as we trample over people's rights as Muslims, we're trampling over the Constitution. I'm sure all of the listeners remember when Senator Obama was running for president, there's a question as to whether or not he was Muslim, full of contradictions, because at the same time, they were attacking him for having a Christian minister named Jeremy Wright. And as far as I remember, most Muslims don't have a Christian minister, but it didn't matter. What they were really saying is that this Black American, not American, this Black man was not really an American citizen, was not a Christian, didn't belong, and couldn't be president. Of course, that lie was propagated by the elites, by the powerful, and by the soon-to-be President Trump, pushing the notion that Obama was a Muslim, Obama was not an American citizen, that Obama did not belong. And the late Colin Powell responded to that, and he said, so what if he is a Muslim? That's not a badge of shame. That is not something that should disqualify him. And I'm proud to say that one of my close friends from living in Minneapolis for more than 10 years is now the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, who, as many of you know, was the first, I believe, the first Muslim to be a member of Congress. And so what we're seeing is the Muslim community, which, as we know, is actually larger than the Jewish community in the United States, is starting to actually engage in the political process, not just as voters, but as candidates themselves. And I think the charge to you and to MLFA is, again, not simply to protect Muslims. That's a serious and important charge, but to help America be America, to help America live up to its dream. One of the most important, and if not the most important, political speech given by a president was the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago. What had happened 7 years ago, President Lincoln? Was that the founding of the Constitution? No, Lincoln skipped the Constitution because he felt the Constitution was a flawed document. It was a document that had allowed the institutionalizing of people not being full citizens. It had allowed the institution of slavery. And so Lincoln was very deliberate. He skipped over the Constitution and went back to that promise that Jefferson had penned. And he said, at the end of that Gettysburg Address, he said, let's have a new birth of freedom. Let's correct the failures that were made in the Constitution. And out of that speech and out of that reach came what's now called the Civil War Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which again tried to create a new birth of freedom, tried to live up to that goal, to that promise, to the values set forth in the Declaration of Independence. So people are afraid. And the war on terrorism turned out to be a war on Muslims. The war on terrorism and the war on Muslims turned out to be a war on the Constitution, a war on the best of the American dream. And I'm not an expert in Muslim law. I'm not an expert in Muslim religion. I have lived in different countries, but I have been, and some would say I'm an expert in constitutional law. I was the legal director, the national legal director of the ACLU for almost 10 years. And I had the pleasure and the obligation to try to protect the Constitution and protect all people under the Constitution. I watched as the United States government created more and more laws directed at Muslims, directed at countries, directed at billions of people around the world. And each time I felt a sense of pain and a sense of loss, that we were stepping back from that American dream. And the stepping back from that American dream is not just, again, what's happening to Muslims, that's important. But I felt like as an African American, that we were turning our backs on our own dreams and maybe on our country itself. The country is deeply divided now. We're deeply polarized. Religion is one of those polarization. Race is one of those polarization. Political affiliation is one of those polarization. And so one of the things we talk about at the Institute a lot is not only having a world in which we all belong, but how do we create that? How do we actually do that? Not just through lawsuits, not just challenging these processes, but through stories, through what we call bridging. How do we talk to people, engage with people interpersonally, intergroup-wise, and structurally that allows people to see that even with our differences, we all belong. And we have a project at UC Berkeley, a bridging project between students, where we're in the process of trying to bring students together. Because really, what this really reflects, what all this fear reflects, is ignorance. It's the lack of knowing. And I'm pleased to say that at the Institute, we have worked under the leadership of Ellison and others to try to bring knowledge, to try to help the Americans who don't know Islam, who don't know people who are Muslims, who don't know even Black Americans, despite Black Americans having been here forever now, but how to bridge that schism. So I hope we'll continue this work, both in the United States and beyond, because in my mind, how we do this work, how we address Islamophobia, how we treat our Muslim brothers and sisters is not just critical for them, it is, but it's critical as to whether or not America will be America, whether or not we will really survive. And if the answer is no, then all of us, and I do mean all of us, ultimately suffer. My time is about up. And again, I want to thank people for having this important discussion today. And I think we have to move to a point where we say no citizen is on probation. They all belong, regardless to their race, religion, national origin, ability, who they love, where they come from. And if we can do that, then we will have truly, really made America into a great country.
Thank you very much, Professor Powell. That was so powerful and so important place. It's so important starting point for this conversation. I just would like to just think about a minute about some of the points you made, is just to sort of set the stage as we move forward. You talked about the shift that you're seeing in this country from African Americans being the scapegoat of all that is wrong with this country to Muslims bearing that pain, and how Muslims are treated with a broad brush. Even, there are a few bad actors, but all Muslims are treated the same. You talked about how we shouldn't be judged by the condition of others, that we shouldn't be characterized by conditions about how we behave, about according to someone else's template, a template that may not include us. The policies and practices that were unthinkable in the face of so-called American values are being practiced against our own against the values of our Constitution as we speak. The First Amendment is supposed to be the most important plank in the Constitution, and yet it is maybe the one that is the most abused. You charged MLFA to not just think about protecting Muslims, but to help all of us be true Americans, and the importance of America being America. How the war on terrorism has been turned into a war on the Constitution. And you talked about bridging and how important that is, and how we had to bridge these divides, the polarization in our country around race, around religion, around politics, and how we can possibly bridge these divides through stories. And then I guess your really compelling final point was that you see the major culprit here being ignorance and a lack of not knowing, a lack of not understanding communities and values, the values of those communities. So there's a lot to digest here and share, and we have an illustrious panel to help us do that. I'm going to first introduce everyone, and then we're going to get right into the conversation, but we're going to leave time for you in the audience to join the conversation as well, and we're going to be bringing back Professor Powell for that part of the conversation, the Q&A portion. I'm going to first start with Zahra Billoo, who serves as the Executive Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations in the San Francisco Bay Area office. It is one of the largest care offices in the country, with a team of civil rights and social justice advocates who work to empower American Muslims through legal services, legislative advocacy, and community organizing. Under her leadership, her office has filed lawsuits against the United States Department of Justice, Abercrombie and Fitch, Southwest Airlines, representing American Muslims who face discriminatory treatment. It has also significantly expanded its capabilities to provide Know Your Rights sessions, while also providing direct legal representation to Bay Area residents who face numerous civil rights violations, including FBI interviews, employment discrimination, airport harassment, school bullying, and hate crimes. Welcome, Zahra Billoo. Next, we have Mubasher Shaukat, who currently serves as a fellow at the Roderick and Solange MacArthur Justice Center, where she works on high-stakes constitutional and criminal litigation and appeals. She was previously a big law litigation associate at O'Melveny and Myers in San Francisco, where she did extensive work on prisoners' rights and immigration. She also fought the Trump administration's family separation and immigration policies, and her work reunited families who were brutally separated at the border and forced to flee Central America. She is the author of American Muslim Women, Who We Are and What We Demand from Feminist Jurisprudence. Welcome, Newish. Yasmin Tayeb is currently serving as the Senior Policy Counsel at Demand Progress. She fled Iran during the Iran-Iraq War and grew up undocumented before becoming a citizen, lawyer, and activist. She holds a JD from the Penn State Dickinson School of Law, a graduate certificate in international human rights law from Oxford University, and a BA in political science from the University of Florida. In 2016, she became the first Muslim woman elected to the Democratic National Committee. She brings 10 plus years of legislative experience. During that time, she worked on Capitol Hill. She directed the Human Rights and Civil Liberties Program at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, lobbying for increased resettlement of refugees, the closure of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, and the repeal of the 2001 AUMF. An incredible panel and a lot much to talk about. So I wanted to start first, and I'll go back to Zahra, to just stepping back from Professor Powell's presentation. There was a lot to digest there. Could you share with us, based on your work and your activism, what is one of his points that resonated most with you?
Hi, thanks so much, Laura, and really everyone at MLFA for today's conversation. There was so much. Professor Powell is someone that I have learned so much from over the years and just really deeply admire. I'll be brief because I'm so excited to hear from my sisters in this work. What resonated for me is just that we are not by any means the first to experience these issues. He mentioned the people who were here before us and the people who were brought here against their will. And in hearing that, I'm so often reminded of my privilege that despite everything second and third generation immigrant Muslims are experiencing, we chose to come here. And that positions us very differently from people who didn't and from people who experienced generations of trauma on this land. But our work is ongoing, and it is interconnected with those who have come before us.
Thank you very much. Mubasher, would you like to share?
Yes, absolutely. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all today. And I think that, there was so much to unpack in Professor Powell's presentation. But one thing that I think really resonated with me is this call towards unity and to recognize and to celebrate and to fight for our collective humanity, and to really internalize the fact that our rights, our identities, and our collective liberties are so intertwined, and that in that is also such a strong message of hope and of learning from one another, of the importance of coalition building and of the importance of really taking a careful look at the strategies that have been successful, and at the ways that we can continue to really open and broaden our conception of who is in our community, that we are not just American Muslims, but that we are Americans, and so interconnected and intertwined with the struggles of all peoples who came before us.
Really important point that you're not alone, and that's a comforting feeling, but it's also an important and valued asset. Coalition building is how most of the systems and movements of justice have made a difference in this country so far, and also to learn from what has come before us, and that many strategies have been tried before, and some of them have been effective and successful, and there's a lot of value in that too. Thank you. And then Yasmin.
Great. Well, thank you so much to MLFA for convening this panel, and to my dear sisters Zahra and Mahvash. Looking forward to being part of this discussion with you today. The one phrase that I would say, Professor Powell's keynote was incredibly powerful and compelling. The one phrase that really resonated with me was when he said that the war on terror was right. It was a war on Muslims, but it was a war on the Constitution. And that's the key framing that so many of us within our community and our allies outside of the Muslim community have been trying to advocate, right, since 9/11, saying that, the government may come for our community today, but they may come for your community tomorrow, right, or next month or next year. And that's what we experienced during the Trump administration, when all of our communities were constantly under attack, whether it was the Muslim community, refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, right, women, the LGBTQ community, and our brothers and sisters and other marginalized and communities of color. And I would completely agree with Mahvash that one of the key points and opportunities for us, especially during the last administration, was having that ability to do the work, to do the coalition building. So just about every issue that I work on, I would probably say that my co-panelists are probably very similar, is that anytime we're advocating on whether it's increasing refugee resettlement, right, pushing back on the Muslim ban, repealing the 2001, 2002, these war authorizations, the key to building more momentum and support and people power is the coalitions that we built, making sure that we try to show that these issues, it's not just insular, it's not just specific to our community, but it's intersectional, that we all need to stand up together in solidarity and fighting for one another, and ensuring that we push back on discriminatory policies that impact our communities.
So that gives me an opportunity to ask a question. Kind of builds on this idea of we're in this together. We need to work together. We need to build coalitions. We need to find and take advantage of strong, successful strategies. So looking at the history of unequal citizenship in the U.S., what tools and strategies would each of you suggest need to be employed, specific strategies that need to be employed to challenge the status quo? And who are the allies in this struggle? Who can you reach out to build those coalitions? Now, I can go back to Sarah if you're ready.
Sure. I'm, just a huge believer in using every tool in the toolbox. So often as a lawyer, people expect that all I am focused on or all I would prioritize is litigation, but individual representation, counseling, advocacy, working with the media, empowering community members and impacted peoples before issues happened. Community organizing and even frankly civil disobedience are all key. And that's just to list a few. That's my old list before Twitter and Snapchat and TikTok were a thing, right? So digital advocacy is also key. We have to use every tool in the toolbox. We know that those who would seek to oppress us, those who would seek to incarcerate us and otherwise target us are using every tool at their disposal. And so we cannot limit ourselves. And we will be most successful when these tools are employed cohesively. So we have to be talking to each other as we're engaging different strategies. I often think of our work on the Muslim ban, where there were people at the airports organizing protests. There were people in newsrooms ensuring that these stories were being told, and there were litigators filing briefs, and the list goes on of the people just doing different things. So every tool in the toolbox. Now, who do we work with? Other targeted communities, right? People who have been in this fight much longer than us, people who we can learn from, and people who we should be advocating for. A very difficult lesson, I think, in South Asian and Arab immigrant communities in the last 20 to 30 years has been just the reality that many of us sat on the sidelines as Black and Latinx communities were targeted for so long. And then we saw, of course, that those strategies were then used against us. And so we need to work with communities who have weathered this storm before, and in many cases are frankly still going through it.
Others, Apish?
You know, I think that Zahra really answered that question very well, very thoroughly. And I don't have a whole lot more to add, but I do want to emphasize that I think it's really, we really need to, I think what we need to do that is really sad to me that hasn't really occurred yet is to really also embrace our intersectional identities as a community. And so the way that we can do that is to really amplify the beautiful, different, and diverse voices within our community, to understand how everybody has a role and everybody can do something. You know, I think one thing Zahra mentioned was this idea of, you know, using like litigation is of course extremely important, but also empowering the voices within our own communities that have been sidelined, that have been silenced, and to really use the strength of our own voices. I think that one thing that is very unfortunately neglected a lot of times is really championing first person narratives and letting people see who we are and to speak for ourselves and to really center the voices of those who are the most marginalized within our communities. So I think that, you know, we've really discovered more recently the power of storytelling and the power of connecting with people. And I think that is something that was sort of underutilized, you know, in the last couple of decades, that's kind of emerging more as a powerful force. I'm a litigator, so I obviously think that litigation is extremely important and it must continue with gusto. And we really need to use every resource available. And one thing I think that's really important is to really, you know, sit down and continue to collaborate with public policy experts and with legal experts and come up with strategies to really go after and do impact litigation in an intelligent way, in a strategic way. And I think that still has to kind of be central to our strategy.
Yasmin. Thank you, Yasmin.
Sure. So my co-panelist Zahra and Mubasher did a phenomenal job in addressing key points in the question. What I wanted to also emphasize, and Mubasher mentioned this, is the power of storytelling, right? So, you know, key moments, and as Zahra was talking about some of the advocacy and organizing that our community did alongside our allies in pushing back against the Muslim and refugee ban. One of the key moments during that fight was and the importance of it was the way we were able to tell these stories, right? So we had key partners that were also helping to lead these fights, including the ACLU, including the Leadership Conference, right? These are massive organizations with millions of members and membership organizations who helped amplify the stories of specific families that had been impacted, Muslim families living in our country impacted by the ban. And I thought that was incredibly powerful, right? Not just being able to tell these stories, so to try to explain to our neighbors and coworkers, right, our friends and associates, that these are actually policies that are impacting folks in your communities and concrete steps that you can take to help. I think that was incredibly powerful tool to be able to then show our elected officials at the federal, state, and local level how they can effectively push back against these policies and how they can be there for our communities and how they can be true allies.
Well, I wanted to move to, because we're an all-star female panel here, I want to talk about the impact on Muslim women in particular, which has been profound. And if you could each in your own way characterize a powerful point about that, but also why is it so important for Muslim women to be uplifted and to be engaged personally in this effort and in this fight? Anyone? You're all doing your own thing in many different ways, and you're in a culture just like mine that doesn't necessarily always celebrate and lift up its own women. So I think that's one challenge that I would say comes out of the African American community. But specifically, as Arshia pointed out earlier in her remarks, women in your community have been deeply demonized and throughout the world.
I'm happy to start really quickly, but I didn't want to keep starting. A few things. Muslim women, in many cases, though not all, wear our religion, I would say, on our sleeves, but we're also wearing it on our heads. We are the most visible targets in our communities at times, and so that's first, right? First and foremost is that we are on the front lines, whether or not we want to be. Among the many possible responses that come up is that the way in which we are profiled and pitted against Muslim men is really challenging, right? So we are oppressed and we need to be protected from Muslim men. We are the reason that we invade Afghanistan. We are the reason that Muslim men are policed and incarcerated. And at the same time, we are complicit, right? So we are submissive, we are oppressed, and we are complicit for standing by and allegedly letting our men do these things. And so not only are we targeted disproportionately when it comes to hate crimes and bullying, harassment, employment law because of our visible or our different visible appearance, but we are also, the cause for violence against Muslim men and then complicit in the violence of Muslim men. And so it's just a very convoluted web that is woven by government narratives, by media narratives, and frankly, sometimes, right, even by people in our own communities. And so attempting to do this work and to speak out when one is the only woman in a space advocating for men is itself a challenge.
And that's why there's the critical mass is in having the sisterhood that you all just talked about is so important. Other ladies want to comment? Just you're nodding your heads, all in agreement. Okay, well, if not, I'll move on because I want to get to another important question.
We need an entire 3-day conference to answer this question.
Absolutely.
One particularly.
I think I lost your sound.
Are you able?
You're in and out. Okay, maybe you're freezing. All
Are
right.
you able to hear me? I'm afraid I may have been getting out.
Stacy, speak now, because we were hearing you a moment ago. Oh, we lost her. Okay. All right. We'll get Mawish back, and if that does happen, the best thing to do is to sign off and sign back in again. Let me just ask another really important question, and that is something that Dr. Bazian mentioned in his opening remarks about the survey that was done. A survey of 1,614 American Muslim members, community members. 79% expressed the feeling that they strongly or somewhat strongly felt insecure and were afraid for their family and kids. How do we address the gap of perception of among Muslims, perception about the implicit violence that is being directed against them, is particularly when it's not even raised or we don't get the attention? Sounds like, are you with us, ladies? So if you heard the question, there's a lot of pain out there when it comes to a lack of security among Muslims based on this survey. How do you address that when people won't even acknowledge that it exists?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and it's a heartbreaking statistic. I'd love to. I'll just give my quick insights, but would love to hear from Zahra, especially because of the work and incredible work that she does on these issues day in and day out at CARE. You know, I think it's so accurate that one of the challenges that we've had in our community is that we, and maybe in the last few years this has changed somewhat, but we could try to do a better job in terms of forming better relationships with either, local press or key, think tanks or advocacy organizations that are very sympathetic to issues of concern for our community. I mean, just to give you an example, there are kind of certain organizations within the progressive movement, like Data for Progress, that does incredible polling and trying to raise awareness of these issues that are impacting our communities. And being able to forge those relationships with those sort of institutions, with local press or national press, to get this information out is incredibly important. And it's something that I know that our community has somewhat struggled, but I think that it's something that we've gotten better at in terms of, again, becoming more politically engaged since 9/11, and particularly so since the election of Donald Trump. But I definitely think that there's opportunities for us to improve those relationships and hopefully do have better opportunities in getting our stories out there.
Okay. Others? And I think we have everyone back now. And then just to make sure you heard the question, we talked about the survey that's been taken that shows that a great majority, like almost 80% of American Muslims don't feel secure for themselves or their families. And there's this bias that's being directed toward them that it's not even really being acknowledged. And so how do we address that?
So it's a few things come to mind in addition to everything Yasmin has said is, one, we name it, right? That's, I think, the first part of it is that so often we've unfortunately become desensitized to these challenges. They're just part of our everyday. They're part of how we experience life daily, life in the United States, life as American Muslims in 2021. And so naming it, I think, is one of the most important things, and the survey is just such a critical tool for that. The second is a variety of things that we've already discussed, which is to say, empowering those who are most impacted to protect themselves, to speak out, to advocate and demand better, and then partnering with other impacted communities to ensure that we are reminded we are not alone in this, but also to harness a larger power bank than we may have on our own.
Great. Other comments? Well, I want to move on. Go ahead, Mephish, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I apologize. I think I got dropped from the broadcast, but I just did want to comment really briefly on your really important question about American Muslim women. And I think, I want to just circle back to that because one particularly harmful feature of Islamophobia has been the distortion and erasure of American Muslim women's identities. Over the years, we have just become this subject of great fascination, and our identities have been, constructed and deconstructed, often weaponized to suit third-party needs, political parties, public interest groups, the government, but our voices and first-person narratives are rarely heard. And even within the law, we are spoken about, we are not listened to. And one particularly harmful feature of intersectional discrimination is that we face discrimination and misogyny from the greater American community, but also, unfortunately, from within the American Muslim community. And even the, amazing women on this panel, you'll see that, we have a variety and a diversity of experiences. But the unfortunate truth is that there are some spaces in which perhaps, Zahra and I might have more standing or power to discuss religion because we wear hijab. And there are some instances in which Yasmin will have more power and legitimacy to discuss Islam because she may be viewed in a different way. And I don't think that we've had enough conversations to really tease these out. These broader systemic issues are not just hypothetical harms, but they are actually things that have, morphed into real harms and real, legal incidences. And to keep it short, I'll just give one specific example. There's an alarming frequency with which American Muslim women's hijabs are being forcibly removed across jurisdictions. And it's almost impossible to obtain legal relief. And these incidences continue to proliferate because there is such a dearth of understanding of why is this practice so harmful, because we don't have a lot of voices out there. There's not a lot of understanding about what it means for Muslim women to wear hijab, the sanctity of that practice, and the importance of upholding Muslim women's religious rights and how that has bearings on the religious liberties of everyone. So I just see it all as incredibly interconnected.
And that gets back to the point about communication and using social media and using communication channels to get those stories out, to tell those stories, and how the positive stories, but also how people are being impacted negatively. Now you said that it's difficult to get legal relief on this issue. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, this kind of ties back to the whole issue of national security and this black box of national security that's spilled over into policing. It's created these kind of unprecedented zones of discretion where the police can justify actions that they think are necessary to maintain safety and security. So if a Muslim woman is arrested, then there are these ridiculous arguments that are made that perhaps she's hiding contraband underneath her hijab and she poses, a risk and a danger and a safety threat to police officers, which is the same sort of bogus arguments that are used to, justify the aggression and, disproportionate use of force against, Black and brown people, because there's a presumption of criminality. You're dangerous. Your identity is already dangerous, and we've subsumed your constitutional rights, your constitutional criminal rights into this black box where safety and security always outweighs your individual liberties.
Thank you. We are going to we were going to ask Professor Powell to rejoin us because we're going into the Q&A segment of this conversation. It's been really so powerful and informative so far. Thank you, Professor Powell. And I just want to throw this question out to any one of you. And this is sort of one of those takeaway questions. What do you want people to take away from this event? And how important is it to amplify this kind of a discussion about what is at stake if people don't engage? Anyone can, what do you want people to take away? And why is it so important to amplify what happens if people don't listen and don't engage on these issues?
Well, I'll jump in. One of the things I think that's clear from the discussion with the panelists, which I thought was really fantastic, is the interconnection. And I think someone also used intersectionality. You know, after 9/11, literally there was a statement, people said, Muslims are the new in now. And sort of the connection, the history. This is, in some ways, we're actually, I mean, we're thinking about talking about Muslims or African Americans. We're really talking about America. We're talking about America trying to become America. And this is, so part of the thing is that this is about America. It's not just about Muslims. It's not just about African Americans. It's not just about Native Americans. It's about America. Is America going to be America? And I think all of us should have skin in the game in that respect. And it's not tolerating each other. It's not just accept. It's actually deeply getting to know each other. I mean, one thing I would just throw in is that fear breeds in ignorance. So we have, when you don't know people, when you don't know information, there's one of the studies show that people who have the hardest attitudes against Muslims don't even know any Muslims. So it's easy to carry those stereotypes. So the stories we tell, the chances we have for people, and so I hope that the work that MLFA is doing is really wonderful. I think stories, though, and even movies, I mean, how do people consume information? Someone talked about social media. I think we have to be, we can't be strangers to each other. We have to know each other better.
Thank you. And I just want to remind our audience that we have a very powerful group of thinkers and doers here, and we welcome your questions. You can put your questions on your Facebook page if you're watching via Facebook, or you can put your questions on YouTube in the comments box, either way. And our staff will be collecting those questions. And we may not get to all of them today, but we want to make sure we get to as many as possible, and because we want to hear from you. Others on the panel want to reflect on this question. If not, I'll move on, because we do have a number of other really great questions coming up here. So another question is, how do we navigate working to build a broad coalition while taking into account the unique circumstances that face the diverse communities that are involved? There are many of us from many different communities who have a lot at stake, and it's been pointed out by all of you earlier, coalition building and working together is crucial. How do we navigate that coalition? How do we work together while also understanding that we have differences, and we have the cultural differences, political differences, opinion differences. There are many divides out there, the kind of divides that Professor Powell mentioned earlier. Anyone?
Sure, I can start. So I do quite a bit of coalition building on many of the issues that I work on. I'll use one coalition that I lead as an example. So immediately after George Floyd was murdered last year, an issue that a lot of advocates started actually in earnest working on police militarization after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014. So after George Floyd was murdered last year, I noticed that, right, like a number of us just got together and we were incredibly upset at seeing the response from local law enforcement and agencies in response to Black Lives Matter advocates and First Amendment protected activity. So I started pulling together different groups, right, that cared about what was happening, that were engaged in the discussion. And the coalition that came together is now over 150 organizations spanning from dozens of organizations within the racial justice community, civil rights community, dozens and dozens of organizations from the Muslim and Arab American communities, the faith community, progressive community, and also key partners in the conservative community, right? A number of libertarian leaning groups. Suffice to say that it is a very the dynamics of the coalition. It's very challenging because of just the differences in terms of the politics of the various communities, and making sure, just understanding the different nuances and what one community finds offensive and what word to use, not to use. This group doesn't work with that group, right? There's so many different.
Could you give an example?
Sure. So to give an example, I mean, there's a couple of conservative partners that we have in our coalition that they may be in the same position as all of the other organizations in terms of police militarization and reining in what this kind of major program called the 1033 program. It's authorized through the Pentagon. Our coalition mainly works on that issue to rein in that program, to ensure that we end the transfer of military-grade weapons to local law enforcement. But when it comes to other issues, right, in terms of civil rights issues, some of those groups are not exactly aligned with the rest of the coalition. And there are certain organizations in the coalition that are very adamant that they program to be shut down, while there are certain organizations that are okay with reforming it, right? Taking a step forward. So I think those are all issues that come up in different coalitions, and trying to find kind of a balance and understanding and being respectful of one another's prior, concerns. And, just at the end of the day, knowing that our goal is to uplift communities of color and communities that have been impacted by police brutality and police violence, making sure that they're at the forefront of the conversations and doing everything we can to advance that issue at the federal and state and local levels.
Thank you.
Just add just a couple of things.
Sure.
So the coalition you just described, it sounds like it's big and it's messy. But think about it. We're a country of about 360 million people. We live in different communities. We have different experiences. It's not surprising, and it shouldn't be surprising, that we have different perspectives. It's not simply that we have different perspectives because we are genetically different. We have different experiences. And it seems to me that part of the thing is sort of being curious about those different experiences, not just my own, but also yours. Which might mean we have something called targeted universalism, which tries to get to this, that we're situated differently, and therefore we will need different responses, not just one response, different responses. The other is that people say change happened at the speed of relationship or the speed of trust. How do we actually build relationships and not always just go to initially disagreements about issues? Who are you? Who am I? The South African word called Thabawanu, which means I see you. And if I see and trust you, I have some understanding of you. It doesn't mean all the problems are going to go away, but not every problem then is sort of existential. Am I curious about you? Am I willing to listen to you? But I do think there's a way in which we can actually navigate, as I guess the question was. And not every difference is a chasm. Differences also can be opportunities, a chance for us to grow. We all have blind spots. We have different blind spots. So together, we cover each other's blind spots. So I think the containers, the stories, the process can help a lot in terms of helping us not only navigate differences, but to celebrate them. We say belonging doesn't require sameness, which is different than how we talked about assimilation before. We're not saying we get along because we're all the same. That's not what we're aspiring to.
Differences can be an asset. They don't have to be an obstacle, and it's something that we can uphold. Thank you. Other comments? I have more questions. Unless anyone else wants to jump in.
I think I just wanted to jump in briefly and say that what I'm hearing, everyone discussing also, boils down to sincerity, and just really continually for all of us who are, working within the movement, who in different areas, to really continuously interrogate ourselves, to continuously be open to that growth, and to be really relentlessly committed to understanding each other, and to understanding that our collective liberation depends on it. And it's not just a nice thing to do, it's really essential to the endeavor of democracy and to ensuring a greater, ability to get rid of this otherness and to really see each other as humans. And I think that also means sometimes questioning our, litigation strategies and not taking personal offense to it. One thing that I've seen that's really, troubles me, though I understand it and I understand why it's effective, is that there are a lot of litigators, including those who have, argued really important cases in the Supreme Court when it comes to executive powers and national security and Muslims and Guantanamo, and the arguments they use, and there's sometimes the winning ones end with phrases like, you may hate this person, but they still deserve constitutional rights. And so I think, there are ways that we can do better. And how can we reinforce this idea of, belonging even within the strategies that we use, and to really, come to terms with that.
Great, thank you. Next question is about sort of our more recent history. And we all know that while Muslim Americans are a racialized minority, no one ethnic group is a majority. And while Muslim Americans tend to be largely, they are not exclusively people of color. How have the Muslim Americans been able to tackle those issues of diversity within their own community, within your own community, during this period of probationary citizenship? And how is the scrutiny of the last 2 decades and all the recent events leading up to the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, how has that played a role in this conversation? How do you tackle these issues within your own community, sort of these issues of diversity, and then how has this recent scrutiny on race and racial justice played a role? Anyone? There's a lot of one of the things that I thought about in your earlier discussion was sort of the push-pull of competition that goes on. You want to work in coalition, you want to work together on common causes, but there's always this, we got to scramble for our piece of the pie, because if we don't, we'll lose everything, and we can't afford to. We have to be in competition with each other, people of color, because there's only so many goodies to go wrong. And how do you fight against that? And specifically, are there any specific strategies that you've explored that have worked in your work? I hope there's been some good work around that.
I think, it's a number of things. First and foremost, there is an internal reckoning that I would say has been happening over the last 20 years, not just around recognizing the racial diversity of the community, but also the socioeconomic diversity, the immigration status diversity, because all of these things contribute with respect to the question of who has access to power. And what power looks like, and what we do when we wield, when we can access that power, or think we can, and so we take pictures with it, and what we do when we can use that power to influence. And so the first thing is that there has been and continues to be an internal reckoning where, there's an awareness being raised about who has which biases, who has which blind spots, who has been taking credit when they shouldn't have, who has been exclusive, and the list goes on. And I think that that's going to take time, right? Is that unlearning the biases that have been deeply ingrained in us is not something that will happen overnight. The second thing is something that Mubasher said, and I forget exactly how you said it, Mubasher, but it struck me and then I forgot the words. But the thing that comes to mind around what she said was, being gracious with each other and calling each other in, to say, like, we are in a lifelong struggle. We are not always going to get it right. And we definitely cannot do it alone. And so I think that's step 2 to the reckoning, is that we have to be able to put those learnings to work to advance our efforts. And we have to be able to, as part of that, see measurable change. So if I look around my mosque, if I look around my organization, and the diversity looks the same as it did 10, 15, or 20 years ago, then I'm not making progress. It may not be where I would have wanted it to be just yet, but it needs to be continually moving. Not just in terms of who is included to fill token seats, but rather who actually impacts decision making.
It's a really interesting point. We need to be able to acknowledge that we can't do it all. We can't do it all tomorrow, and that we will make mistakes, but it's important to learn from them, and then to celebrate the impact and progress that we've had. Maybe it's not where we thought we would be 10 years ago, but it's progress and it's making a difference. I think we have time maybe for just one more quick question, and this is around, there's a couple of questions around policing. What would you like to communicate to police departments around the nation regarding Muslims and structural Islamophobia? That's a big one, but I take it that police departments are probably a major culprit in terms of discriminatory practices against
Laura,
Muslims.
In the chat, they're saying they were not recommending that we ask that. They felt like it would take us away from
Okay, sorry about that. I will move on. Okay, considering the political split in the country, what are the short-term areas to focus on in our collective civil rights, and what are the long-term areas? Considering the political split in the country, what are the short-term areas to focus on, and what in our collective civil rights, and what are the long-term areas?
Well, one of the short-term ones I would say is we see right now is voting and civic engagement. As I said earlier, there's a growing number of, in the Muslim community, the Latino community is growing even faster, but we're not always participating. And even when we participate, sometimes we participate at a fairly low level. So the idea that now we have different people running for office, I think is really great. I think that's a short or medium term. And anyway, so that's, but I think the long term is to really create a space where everyone can participate, everyone belongs, that people can carry multiple identities. So, if we think if someone's Muslim, we may think we know them. If we think someone is Black, we may think we know them. But as one of the speakers said, we all carry multiple identities. So I think long term is to create a space in a country where everyone feels like they have a voice. Everyone, every race, every religion, every nationality, every gender. We used to talk about just 2, now we actually talk about more. And how do we do that given the fear, given that some people weaponize that fear? It's going to be a struggle, but it seems to me that's the long-term goal.
It's a lofty goal, but it's one that we have to keep in front of us at all times. I want to thank our illustrious panel and keynoter for this incredible conversation. And we're going to move now and back to the audience, and we want to ask our audience 2 questions. And please take a few minutes to think about them and answer these questions in your chat boxes on your platforms. Number 1 question is, what issues from this discussion are most important to you? We want to know what issues are most important to you from this discussion. We want we want to be able to take away that from you. And then what do you think is the most important? What do you think is most important for MLFA to take action on? What issues or what strategies do you think are most important for MLFA to take on? Please think about those questions. The questions imply MLFA wants to hear from you. They're working, they want to be on the ground and doing important work that's going to include your voice and your issues and your concerns. And so please think about this and share this in your chat, and we will be collecting that information. It's been, we're ending the first half of our conversation. It's been an incredible conversation and moment so far. And I want to now take a moment to turn it back over to Hathambasian, who's going to give us the MLFA perspective.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the audience. But let me thank our panelists, Zahra Billu, Mavish Shaukat, and Yasmin Tayyib, but also to make sure to thank Professor John Powell for his remarks, for his comments. I think there are many messages that we got and gleaned out from this. The notion that America has came into existence in a contradiction, that all human, not all men, but all human created equal, was always been confronted with the reality of exclusion, the reality of not only our indigenous communities, our Black brothers and sisters, women, and the list goes on. So we're always are facing this contradiction in America's history, and then the tension today between those who want to define America as a settler society, settler Christian Protestant society, versus again the notion that America is made of immigrants, while also recognizing that not every immigrant arrived to this country equally. The indigenous community have been here before anyone arrived, and our Black brothers and sisters came in the hulls of ships as commodities, and their relationship of America as entangled, tortured, and as inspiring as well in terms of resistance as anything else. The conversation from Zahra, Mavish, and Yasmin really put the focus on how to work in coalition with the complexities and the topography at this particular time that is challenging, and how to navigate at this critical time this intersectionality and also the heavy focus on the Muslims. And I think both all of our speakers amplified some of the comments from Professor Powell that the war on terror was a war on Muslims, and the war on Muslims ended up being a war on the Constitution. So we're handed as MLFA is really how to defend the Constitution, not that it is a total ideal, but it is working toward the ideal of everyone being equal in the treatment of the law, equal in the society, feeling of belonging. I want to lift up a little bit Zahra's statement in relations to the challenge faced by Muslim women. On the one hand, they are put forth as the cause for invading and for disciplining Muslim men. But at the same time, Zahra mentioned the complicity in either silence or making it possible for Muslim men to engage in abuse, violence, and so on toward Muslim women, which is in essence, you're between a rock and a hard place in this sense. And I think this is a very important piece as we begin to work or continue to work in MLFA, is how to navigate these contradictions that are present, in particular relative to the subject of Muslim women, knowing on the one hand they are the primary targets of Islamophobic violence. And again, I looked at the studies on Islamophobia, whether it's in Europe, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and also in some places, how that 75 to 85% of all violent attacks target Muslim women, but yet they're also often are being silenced. The charge that has been given to MLFA is how to work toward making America live up to its ideal and actualize the belonging of everyone in the society. So it's a very tall order and a very critical charge, but it is the one that we need to embrace. and we need to take. So MLFA, as we are both, it's very difficult to say celebrating 20 years, but celebrating 20 years of resisting the war on terror, resisting the demonization of the Muslim community, the targeting of the community. It's to celebrate our resistance, but the perseverance in this road. It's also to reorient ourselves into the next stage of our work by really taking on the challenge of defending the Constitution and making America a place of belonging to everyone. There is no such thing in law as being half a citizen. We need to aspire that America embraces the full citizenship of all. And also, I'm a very strong advocate for the communities that are currently are even more marginalized, especially the undocumented communities from our brothers and sisters in the Latinx community. So also we need to think about what does the future look for America, and what does belonging and inclusion looks like, and how actually to be able to speak your truth and to be included on your own with your own story and your own narrative. I will conclude the following, that Muslims in general, and I would say communities of color, that we're often being invited into a theater piece or a story about ourselves, but yet we're never asked to actually be in our own story. We're being asked to be supporting actors in our own narrative. So the time for us to actually insist not only that our story is to be told by our own voice and our own narrative, but we also should be the ones that actually design the set and all the furnitures and the colors that comes with it. So thank you for being with us in the first panel, and I'll turn it back to our moderator, Laura Washington. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bazian. And you were telling your own story today. Absolutely. Absolutely. This is your story. It's the story of your community, and it's very powerful. And I have to say, you have much to celebrate in this 20 years. You just think, it's been a struggle. It's been a challenge. There's too much work left to be done. But what if you had not, what if MLFA had not been here for the last 20 years, persevering? Where would the community be? So be proud and celebrate. I'm now going to bring us into the second half of this program, and by introducing our next very important keynote speaker, our final keynote speaker. Jonathan Manis is an attorney at the Roderick and Solange MacArthur Justice Center, and he's also an adjunct professor of law at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law. He's an expert in government transparency, free speech, and press freedom, and he's published scholarly work on the conflicts between secrecy and democratic accountability with respect to national security and surveillance practices. At the MacArthur Justice Center, he has won the freedom he won the freedom of a Muslim immigrant who had been detained under a never before used Patriot Act provision that purports to allow indefinite detention on U.S. soil without charge or trial. His current work challenges the racially disparate impact of police surveillance at the local level. Previously, he directed the Civil Liberties and Transparency Clinic at the University at Buffalo School of Law. He has also served as a clinical lecturer and Abrams Fellow at the Yale Law School's Media Freedom and Information Access Center. Welcome, Jonathan Manis.
Thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. I also want to thank Dr. Bazian, Arshia, and MLFA for convening this symposium and inviting me to speak to these important topics. It's a real honor. And I also want to thank Professor Powell, Zahra, Mavish, Yasmin for such a deep and insightful discussion so far. I'm going to be echoing some of the themes that were raised in the first half of the symposium. But what I want to focus my remarks on today, more specifically, is the landscape that American Muslims face in the federal courts, especially in cases where the government is asserting national security as a basis for taking some kind of action, be that in the context of immigration or the criminal legal system or administrative sanctions like the no-fly list or detentions at the border, that sort of thing. Now, over the last 15 years, I've had the privilege of working at a number of different organizations, And in those contexts, I've had the privilege of representing Muslim clients in cases asserting their civil rights and civil liberties against the considerable might of the federal government. So I'm going to be speaking from that experience, as well as from my observations more broadly of what has been happening in the courts these past 20 years or so. So like every good lawyer, I'm going to start with the conclusion. So the stories I'm going to tell today, I think, illustrate a hard reality. The federal courts have frequently failed in their responsibility to serve as a forum for people, particularly Muslims, who have been seeking to vindicate their constitutional rights against the government. Too frequently, the courts have barred the courthouse door to people who have suffered egregious abuses. Courts have found reasons to dismiss their cases without reaching the actual substance of the constitutional claims. At the same time, and maybe a little paradoxically, I think some of the stories I'm going to tell today also show that the federal courts are and remain an absolutely indispensable protection for civil rights and civil liberties. I think they're still our best hope for people who find themselves tangled up in the national security apparatus of the government. So sometimes I think, I'll start though by saying that sometimes I think when we're talking about questions about Muslim civil rights, the humanity of people whose rights have been violated isn't centered in the conversation. Certainly that's not the case today, but often these discussions proceed at a pretty high level of abstraction. So we'll talk about things like the balance between civil liberties and national security, or about the conflicts between the prerogatives of the executive branch and the role of the courts as an independent check. But these sort of high-minded disputes about structure elide the fact that over the last 20 years, it's been Muslims, or people perceived to be Muslim, who've been most directly and viscerally impacted. And I think it's important to center that. You know, this came into focus for me. I'll just start with a little anecdote here. This came into focus for me about 15 years ago in a conversation that I had with a very powerful senior attorney at a large law firm in New York City, where at the time I was interviewing for a job. I was still in law school at the time. This was around 2006, so it's the middle of the George W. Bush administration. And by this point, there was a concerted effort among many liberal legal elites to oppose some of the worst abuses of that administration, things like torture and indiscriminate detention, military commissions. And at that time, I was a member of a legal clinic that was focused on civil liberties and national security as a law student. And I was spending a lot of my time working on behalf of a Muslim man named Abdullah al-Kid, who was an American citizen who himself had been detained without charges and treated like a terrorist suspect for weeks, based on a pretext that he was a material witness and using a material witness warrant improperly. So it was in that context that I found myself as a pretty young law student sitting across from this powerful lawyer interviewing at his firm. And he saw that I'd been working on this case, Mr. Al-Kid's case, and he asked me a sort of unexpected question, which was, why do lawyers have a special responsibility when it comes to these kinds of national security and civil liberties issues? And I was caught a little off balance. I didn't expect to be getting that kind of question in a job interview. And I think I mustered some kind of meandering answer about how maybe we lawyers are better at seeing the importance of basic principles, no matter the circumstances, something a little bit abstract like that. And he wasn't very impressed, I don't think. And he responded by giving his own answer to his own question. What he told me was that the reason why it's important for lawyers to take on these abuses is that this is about who we are and defending what America stands for. It's just not American for the Bush administration to be doing these things. So I remember being very impressed at the time. His answer was obviously a much stronger talking point. What could be more compelling than the idea that defending against these abuses was a matter of vindicating our core values? On the other hand, I left that interview feeling a little unsettled, and it occurred to me that this way of framing the issue completely elided the people who were the subject of these abusive policies. That is, Muslim people, or people who are perceived to be Muslim, and it elided the fact that Muslims were also part of us, also part of America, whose values we're seeking to defend. Jameel Jaffer, who was formerly the Deputy Legal Director at ACLU, he's recently written about this, and he observed that this way of framing the issues made it centrally a question about us, not about, quote, them. And this framing really did nothing to challenge the sort of prejudiced narratives that were casting all Muslims under a cloud of suspicion, and which many ways still do. So, turn now to what we've seen in the courts of the last 20 years or so, and since those days, the federal courts have now decided many national security cases in which Muslim people were appealing to the courts to vindicate their constitutional rights. Now, of course, it's hard to generalize 20 years of case law, but if these judicial decisions are a reflection of our values, it seems like one strong value seems to be that the federal courts, and the appellate courts in particular, are very reluctant to allow relief against the government in these cases. The federal courts have been very inventive at erecting obstacles that prevent people from suing the government to vindicate their rights, especially in the face of national security claims by the government. So, for example, cases have been dismissed because defending them could require the government to disclose supposed state secrets. This rationale is why, for example, nearly all of the claims brought by victims of U.S. torture seeking accountability were dismissed. Other times, cases are dismissed because the courts give a kind of uncritical deference to the executive branch's national security justifications. The most glaring recent example of this is Trump v. Hawaii, the case challenging the Trump administration's ban on travel from numerous Muslim majority countries. And in that case, despite President Trump's open vitriolic hostility to Muslim immigrants, despite his repeated calls for a, quote, complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, despite his explicit remarks, even while he was in office, linking the travel ban to these Islamophobic objectives, despite all that, the court upheld the ban. And it did so by deferring to the government's post hoc justifications for the travel ban, even though those justifications were pretty clearly contrived by government lawyers after the fact in an attempt to sort of paper over the bigoted motivations that were driving the policy from the Oval Office. The federal courts have also turned away the claims of Muslim plaintiffs for reasons that have had little to do with national security, but which have had very broad ramifications for all kinds of civil rights cases in the United States. So just one case to focus on, the case of a man named Javed Iqbal. Now, Mr. Iqbal was a Pakistani Muslim man who'd been living and working here in the United States for 10 years before the 9/11 attacks. He worked as a cable repairman on Long Island. He'd married an American citizen. He had nothing to do with the terrorist attacks, and the government never alleged otherwise. But after 9/11, he became one of thousands of Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian men who were swept up by federal law enforcement, detained, and subjected to terribly abusive conditions of detention. After he was eventually released and deported, he sued. And he sued the leadership of the Department of Justice, alleging that they had established an unconstitutional policy of indiscriminately arresting and detaining people like him, that is, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian men, on the basis of their religion and ethnicity, without any legitimate law enforcement purpose. So Mr. Iqbal's case, amazingly, reached all the way to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court directed that these claims had to be dismissed. And the court reasoned that these allegations were simply not plausible. And so they needed to be dismissed right at the outset before any opportunity to investigate and corroborate them. Specifically, the court dismisses implausible the idea that senior officials of the government would enact a policy targeting people on account of their race and ethnicity. The court actually went further, declared that there was a, quote, obvious alternative explanation, unquote, for the government's actions, which was that the government was engaged in a legitimate law enforcement investigation following the 9/11 attacks, and that any disproportionate effect on, quote, Arab Muslims was merely incidental and perhaps something that should be expected given the demographics of the 9/11 attackers. Parenthetically, Mr. Iqbal was not Arab. He was from Pakistan. But setting that aside, this decision issued in 2009, I think it reflected a profound reluctance by the court to take seriously the religious animus that Muslims were facing in the United States. As Professor Shirin Sinar at Stanford has written, the court's majority seemed to endorse the idea that it was unremarkable for the government to arrest and detain thousands of people who happened to share a religion or perceived ethnicity with the 9/11 attackers. And of course, Professor Sinar and others have documented that subsequent investigations have revealed, in fact, significant evidence that religion did motivate decisions about who to sweep up in these for detention and investigation. So, this case is important, not just because it shows how courts have declined to take seriously the claims of religious animus targeted against Muslims in America. I think it's also important because it illustrates vividly that this struggle for Muslim civil rights is coextensive with the broader struggle for civil rights in this country on behalf of all people. So one of the most remarkable things about this case is that it is one of the most widely read cases the Supreme Court has issued in the last 20 years. Literally every first-year law student reads this case, but they don't read it because it's an important case about religious discrimination or national security. They read it because this new test of plausibility that the court used to throw out Mr. Iqbal's claims now is the standard that governs every single case that's filed in federal courts in this country. This plausibility hurdle is now a bedrock part of civil procedure, and it's made it much harder for people to bring all kinds of claims in federal court. So whether people are alleging workplace discrimination or a Fair Housing Act violation, whatever, they have to surmount this new plausibility threshold. So this case, which was about trying to vindicate the rights of a Muslim man swept up by the government, was one in which the Supreme Court took the opportunity to make a quite sweeping change in the law that affects the rights of literally every person who now tries to sue in federal court to vindicate their rights. This same thing has happened in other areas of law and doctrine. Cases that were sort of considered as exceptional national security cases have come to limit the rights of people in a much broader context. So I think it's a mistake to put these and other cases that have touched the Muslim community into a silo. They really affect us all. So I promised at the beginning of my conversation, though, that I was going to not only provide bad news, that the news about the state of the federal courts, that there was reason to be hopeful as well. I suggested that the federal courts are indispensable. And it's true, there have been massively important victories in federal courts. And I do believe that the courts remain an essential protection for American Muslims and for the protection of all of our constitutional rights in this country. Now, why do I say this? Given everything I've already said about closing the courthouse doors, why do I say this? It's pretty simple. It's because when people find themselves targeted by the government, especially in the context of national security, the courts remain the most powerful venue we have in which people can defend themselves. At their best, courts are institutions that are designed to unearth the truth, to figure out what really happened, to separate fact from fiction. And this truth-seeking function is absolutely essential for protecting civil rights and civil liberties. If the government could rely on mere suspicion or unproven allegations to deprive a person of their rights, then literally any deprivation of rights could be justified. And there are numerous examples in the last 20 years where the courts have done this essential work of ascertaining the facts and exposing the government's allegations, often exposing the government's allegation as overblown, exaggerated, or outright false. And I'll highlight two striking examples of the courts playing this role. So first, Regina Ibrahim, she was a graduate student at Stanford University in 2004 when she discovered that she had been placed on a no-fly list. She went to the airport and was denied boarding. She was trying to go to a conference, I believe, in Hawaii. Her visa was then revoked, which meant she had to forfeit the rest of her time and scholarship at Stanford. She sued to clear her name to get herself off the no-fly list. But for 7 years after she sued, the government fought the case tooth and nail, trying to have the case dismissed without having ever to disclose the reasons why she was put on the no-fly list in the first place. Eventually, after multiple appeals, the courts finally forced the government to explain itself. And in the course of a 5-day trial, which was conducted largely in secret, the court finally learned a remarkable fact. The only reason that Dr. Ibrahim had been put on the no-fly list was that an FBI officer had literally ticked the wrong box on a form. As the judge wrote after the trial, quote, "At long last, the government has conceded that plaintiff poses no threat to air safety or national security and should never have been placed on the no-fly list. She got there by human error within the FBI," unquote. Without the courts as a check against the government, Miss Ibrahim, Dr. Ibrahim, I should say, would likely still be on that list, flagged falsely as a terrorist threat. Another stark example is the case of Adam Hassoun, a man who I was privileged to be able to represent over the last few years. He's a stateless Palestinian man who grew up in Lebanon during the civil war there. And he lived in South Florida and raised a family there for something like 10 years. Then in 2007, Mr. Hassoun was convicted of material support and other related crimes for gathering money and sending it to places like Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s, where Muslim people were being persecuted in the context of armed conflicts. And after Mr. Hassoun had finally completed this sentence in 2017, and I should say that the judge in that case rejected the government's effort to get a life sentence and actually issued a sentence that was half the minimum of the guidelines range. He wasn't persuaded he was any kind of threat. In any case, after he finished his sentence, the government refused to let him go. It transferred him to immigration detention at an ICE prison near Buffalo, New York, and it tried to continue his incarceration there indefinitely. The government ended up invoking a provision of the Patriot Act that purports to give the Secretary of Homeland Security unilateral power to detain a non-citizen indefinitely, potentially for life, based on his say-so. This was the first time the government had invoked that law. In this case, the government was making some eye-popping allegations against our client, accusing him of devising these fantastical plots from inside the immigration facility. The government provided no evidence. Of course, Mr. Hassoun couldn't have denied these allegations more strongly and persuasively, and we were just at a loss. Like, where was this stuff coming from? Fortunately, we had a judge who was committed to getting to the truth, and over the course of 6 months, we discovered that the allegations against Mr. Hassoun were nothing more than fabrications from fellow detainees at the immigration prison who were themselves trying to avoid deportation. They were just making up these stories against Mr. Hassoun because they hoped the government would find them useful and then give them favors. So the most remarkable part of this case was when we discovered that the central allegation against Mr. Hassoun came from another detainee who had made that exact same allegation about the exact same fake terrorist plot against some other person a decade earlier. He had just completely fabricated the allegation and recycled it to pin it on our client. It would have been obvious, this would have been obvious to anyone who had bothered to read that informant's immigration file, but it became clear to us and to the court that the government hadn't done any work to try to corroborate its allegations. It was just using these false jailhouse informant allegations to try to imprison our client potentially for life. The judge saw all this and she ordered Mr. Hassoun to be released. And within a month of that ruling, Mr. Hassoun was stepping off a plane in Rwanda as a free man. The government refused to release him into the United States, but the nation of Rwanda agreed to accept him as a stateless person on humanitarian grounds. Without that judge's careful work, Mr. Hassoun would almost surely remain locked up today based on the pack of lies. So I think getting to the conclusion here, these stories point to the indispensable roles that courts can and do continue to play to safeguard the civil liberties of all people. When courts treat each person as an individual entitled to equal justice and give them all the presumptions of good faith that our system demands, then justice can be done, and we've seen that. These stories also, I think, point to the absolutely essential role that lawyers have played in these cases. It takes tenacious and dedicated lawyers to take on these difficult cases. These kinds of cases are often lengthy, complicated, unpopular, and without excellent pro bono lawyers willing and able to do the hard work, the courts simply cannot serve their role as an effective check on the government and against abuse. The Muslim Legal Fund of America has been supporting the work of lawyers like this for years now, and lawyers like these are out there defending the rights of people who are so often vilified in our society. So their work and this work is absolutely essential to preserving all of our rights and liberties. So I want to conclude by returning to that job interview 15 years ago. You know, these days I sometimes think back on that interview and I wonder what answer I would have given to that powerful lawyer's question. Why is it so important for lawyers to do this work? And fine, yes, part of this is about fighting for a set of American ideals. It's about fighting for a vision of the Constitution. But at a more fundamental level, it's also about fighting to make sure that people who are currently seen as constitutional outsiders, that's to say Muslims in America, come to be seen as full members of that American community whose values we're trying to vindicate. It's about lawyers' obligation to represent the common humanity and dignity of every client. It's about fighting to try to make sure that every person can come to court without being saddled by prejudices or suspicions simply on account of their religion or their perceived ethnicity. You know, with respect to Muslims in America, that is a project that's not yet complete, but this work is happening daily in our courts, and it's, I think, an essential part of how we will move toward a society and a legal system in which everybody, Muslims, non-Muslims alike, are viewed as equal members of our community. And I'll stop there, and I'm very much looking forward to the panel discussion and the questions from the audience later. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan Maness. It's clear from the powerful work that you've done and the persistent work you've done over the years that you learned a valuable lesson from that important lawyer's question so long ago. And that question is still, as we heard, that question emerged in our last discussion earlier in this program in terms of Muslim people being perceived as the other and not part of America. So it's something that I think should resonate with everyone who's working on this, doing this important work. And it just also shows how important the work that MLFA has been doing over the last 20 years, because of course they've been doing a lot of work in the courts in terms of legal advocacy. And as you say, the courts and the law are the most important, most powerful tool that can give us hope going forward. So thank you for that. And now I'm going to turn to, please stand by, Jonathan, we're going to bring you back a little bit later, but I want to turn to our panel and introduce them. And I'm going to start, as we bring our panel up, we have a very important and illustrious group of people here to comment both on Mr. Maness's speech and some of the work that they've been doing. Regina Ibrahim is an associate professor of American Studies, Religious Studies, and Anthropology at Yale University. Her research focuses on race, gender, religion, nationalism, and transnationalism across a wide spectrum of American Muslim communities. Her first book, Islam is a Foreign Country, American Muslims and the Global Crisis of Authority. Her forthcoming book is the Quran a Good Book?, which combines ethnographic and cultural studies and analyses with historical research to trace a place of the Islamic scripture in the American imagination, particularly in relation to national debates about tolerance. She has received awards for her writing and research grants from the Fulbright, Wintergren, and Luce Foundations. Welcome. Next, we have Wadi Said, who is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina, a graduate of Princeton University and the Columbia University School of Law. He served as an articles editor of the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. He previously served as visiting professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and as an assistant federal public defender in the Office of the Federal Public Defender for the Middle District of Florida, where he represented a defendant in the U.S. versus Al-Arian case, which was a complex terrorism conspiracy case. His book, Crimes of Terror, The Legal and Political Implications of Federal Terrorism Prosecutions, is a comprehensive legal analysis of the criminal terrorist prosecution in the United States. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. And finally, Dr. Sharik Siddiqui, who is an assistant professor of philanthropic studies and director of the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. He earned a PhD and an MA in philanthropic studies from the Lilly School. He also holds a JD from the McKinney School of Law at Indiana University and a BA in history from the University of Indianapolis. Most recently, he conducted a national survey of full-time Islamic schools in the United States, which resulted in a book that he co-authored, Islamic Education in the United States and the Evolution of Muslim Nonprofit Institutions, which was published in 2017. Welcome all. Thanks for being here. And much to unpack in terms of what Mr. Banish just shared with us, but I wanted to just open up by asking if you have, he talked about hope and the fact that he struggled through a lot of very important and very difficult cases, but he's had some successes. We've had some successes in the legal system, and that gives him hope in the law. I would want to ask each one of you, what gives you hope as you look forward to the work that you look backward at the work you've done and look forward to the work that you will continue to do? Now, I'll start with Zarina.
Great. Well, it's so wonderful to be with everyone here today and to learn so much. I, of course, am heartened by all of the radical lawyers that I know and, their enormous work and dedication and their morale, despite all the stumbles that we've had. I wouldn't say that it's, for me, I would disagree with Professor Manis as far as the courts and the legal system being the primary tool or the kind of sort of the. I would say it is a tool. It can be, the courts can be a tool, but what I am most sort of inspired by or look to is actually the grassroots movements, mobilization we have happening on the ground to make change, both policy changes but also social changes. That's really where my hope is. Because I am demoralized by many of the legal cases. The ones he described, I think you could probably pick any American Muslim at random, and they have personally in their own social network have a connection to each one of these kinds of cases: political prisoners, people who've been on the no-fly list and are trying to get off of it, et cetera. And so it has been so enormously pervasive. And so that's what I would say is really, that's where my hope is.
What would you say, what is there about the grassroots movement that is so powerful, and why do you see it as such an important tool, especially right now?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of mobilization and solidarity that we saw, in the wake of the quote unquote travel ban. Of course, it was a Muslim ban. I mean, as we know, and I think as was pointed out so beautifully in the keynote, these policy bombs, these laws that are not explicitly racial, but are certainly racial in their effects. That is what we're all grappling with. In other words, this is, it's called the travel ban to claim a kind of neutrality, but of course it is intended to target the racialized populations of Muslims. So, for me, what we saw happen after that which was the enormous protests that happened just all over the country, people showing up in airports. That is where I think the real excitement is, and the solidarity that you have, where people connecting the dots, which is what I try to do in the classroom, what I see people doing in the streets between the war on terror to the war on drugs to the war on terror, the quote unquote immigration crisis and its connection to the war on terror, to always, to look at indigenous populations. I mean, when I think back to that moment, I think to, the Native American activists who are showing up in airports and saying Muslims are welcome here. Right. In other words, they're both marking that this is a colonial settler colonial society, but they're also saying that, but yet we have room for refugees and we have room for migrants. And so I think that's really where, the real change comes from. And the law is always, a few steps behind catching up. That said, we definitely all rely on as I said, the work of radical lawyers, and those moments, it almost feels like a miracle every time a judge does the right thing and doesn't dismiss the case and does push it through, and we do see a little bit of incremental change.
Thank you. And speaking of radical lawyers, Wadi Sayed, I would like to see if you want to comment on anything particular that Jonathan Maness had to say, and also ask you what gives you hope as you move forward with this work.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me and for being here today. I think, what we heard, what Jonathan was saying, I in a large sense agree that it's not hopeful. I would even take it a step further and say I'm even more pessimistic that the law provides any real kind of hope for transformative change. I think, when you look at some of the cases he cited, I mean, for example, his client, Hassoun, was part of the Jose Padilla prosecution. And, Jose Padilla had been tortured by the government, and then because the government didn't want a negative precedent in the Supreme Court, they released him, and he was picked up and automatically put into, or basically put into the criminal justice system, where he was charged with a whole series of crimes, the theories behind which, and this covered Mr. Hassoun as well, were completely, so incredibly expansive and so incredibly broad to basically criminalize up to a point being a religious Muslim, believing in something like jihad in the sense of, the religious sense of the term, and applying it to movements in, I think it was something like 20 countries. So, I think to echo what Professor Grewal was saying, I think, the real kind of heavy lifting gets done in the communities who kind of fight back. I view kind of the role of the lawyer in these type of national security cases. I mean, I wrote a whole book where my whole point about criminal prosecutions of people charged with being terrorists basically are opening it up to expand the government's discretion across the board. So it's not, it might be a terrorist, a person with an Arab name or an Arab background or a Muslim background today, but it's really setting the precedent for these kind of tactics to kind of be applied across the board. And and so I view the role of the lawyer as kind of like, backs to the wall, just making a stand in the face of a very hostile, not just, prosecution or, government, but also the courts, which are not really there to help. There was a smattering of cases here and there where people obtained relief, but those are sort of a drop in the bucket. I think, and I think sort of going forward from that, making a stand begins with insisting on correcting the government's narrative. And I think when I was a public defender and I worked on the Sami al-Arian prosecution, I defended a fellow called Hathambasian. One of the things that I was, and my colleagues probably saw this in me, mildly to moderately at times, and even seriously obsessed with the idea of correcting the government's mistakes. They made mistakes, linguistic mistakes, cultural mistakes, and these mistakes kind of do violence to the idea of, people from the Middle East, South Asia, of Muslim backgrounds, of Arab backgrounds, kind of not, in the government's view, not really belonging here, not being allowed to belong here. And I think that's the role of the lawyer, to kind of fight back against those types of allegations, to fight back against this idea that, that these people are lesser citizens or entitled to lesser protections than, the mainstream of American society. Because, I think when you start going head to head on the law, I, for example, in the Muslim ban case, I wasn't surprised the Supreme Court ruled the way it did. It upheld the ban. That they relied on precedent from a case over, 120 years old, called the Chinese Exclusion Act case, the Chai Chan-ping, the Chinese exclusion case, where the government exercised a kind of a similar power against Chinese from, the late 18th century. So the law is a tool for sure, but it's more about, being a forum to make a kind of a stand. I'm glad Adham Hassoun received relief in the end, and that took an amazing effort by Professor Manis and and his colleagues. But those are the victories that we can't really rely on. I agree with Professor Grewal. We want to be changing the message from the grassroots, and lawyers aren't as great with that.
But there is a partnership. I mean, when you talk about the work around the travel ban or the Muslim bans, that happened at the airports, where I remember that happened right here at O'Hare Airport, where there were lawyers stationed around the clock working with the activists, working with the folks out there outside the airport protesting. So is there a partnership there? Is there an alliance here that's important to raise up?
100%. I agree. Yes, and that's what I was, I think, trying to say. So thank you for clarifying that for me. I think the critical point here is that when you try to kind of challenge the government as to its power and its discretion, if you look just at outside of any national security context, if you look at what the police are allowed to do, in terms of they can arrest someone for on the basis of a violation that would never lead to jail and put a person in jail, right? They have this power. What's basically, and the Supreme Court has signed off on these types of powers. They can stop and frisk people. I'm sure you know all about the stop and frisk cases, the so-called Terry power, which has exercised, cities across America because it's applied against, usually young men of color in a discriminatory fashion. But the power exists. It's all about insisting that the government not exercise that discretion. So challenging the power in courts, I think, is a tough one. But insisting that the authorities think twice before exercising that discretion is, I think, the key.
Thank you. Dr. Siddiqui, what is your take on what you've heard so far, and give me some hope?
So first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this conversation and for this wonderful esteemed panel that I'm really honored to be part of. What gives me hope is how far we've come, right? I remember like yesterday where we were on 9/11, and back then we didn't have a book from Regina Ibrahim, which has been really instrumental, or Wadi Saeed and the work of Professor Manis. So whether it was academic, whether it was academia, whether it was in civil society, whether it was in law, we didn't have the tools or the opportunities that we have today. So I think we've come a long way, and in many ways, when we look at where we are today, it is demoralizing, right? It is. We feel that we should have been much further ahead. We're dealing with some of the challenges that we've been dealing for. If you look at Gambhir Sqaseri's book, History of Islam in America, for centuries. But it's incredible what we've done in 20 years. And at the core of that is civil society, grassroots activists, nonprofit organizations like Muslim Legal Fund of America, and philanthropy. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we released a report on Muslim American giving. And what's interesting is that Muslim Americans give despite being only 1% of the population, despite being poorer, give more than the general household in America. But what's interesting within that is that in their prioritization of giving, 84% of their money stays in the US, right? Props up American Muslim and secular organizations that are providing the bedrock for civil society activism. And the other interesting piece within that report was that support for civil rights and law has grown over time. If you looked at the Zogby poll in 2002 and 2004, civil rights and legal issues were not as big of a priority as they are now. And interesting within that is it's not just Muslim philanthropy for Muslim-led nonprofit organizations that do work in civil rights and legal sectors, not just for their own rights, but also for civil rights broadly. For example, Black Lives Matter, Muslims support compared to other faith communities is at the highest levels within that report. So that shows that, while we have these archaic institutions like the law, which find it very difficult to sort of innovate and progress. And that's, we've had progress through the law, but by and large, what we see is civil society, nonprofits, and philanthropy really push the needle, and then the law follows. And I think that's what Dr. Grewal and Professor Said also mentioned. So that's what gives me hope, is the people that are involved in this, the work of the Muslim Legal Fund of America. I remember what it was, where it was 20 years and now where it is. I think there's a lot of opportunities for hope, a lot of work to be done, but we've done a lot with very little in a very short period of time.
And what would you account for that? I don't know if your research delved into this. What's the reason behind what this generosity, particularly at such a time when Muslims are under such siege, that they're yet reaching out and giving at such great lengths?
So, I think it's probably three things, right? One is the fact that Muslim Americans happen to be Americans, right? And they happen to be an American minority. So if you think about Jewish Americans, they tend to be more generous than the general population because, and if you think about African Americans, or if you think about Latinos and so on, all of these groups of people that are under pressure are, sort of draw upon their own indigenous ideas and cultures and traditions of giving because they have to, right? We realize, just like Jewish Americans did and continue to do so, and Latino Americans and African Americans and all the other minorities, that ultimately we have to sort of punch above our body weight, as it were. And so I think some of that generosity is by the fact that American minorities traditionally have been very engaged. And I don't think but the way we think about philanthropy is about white rich men, for example, doesn't allow us to sort of think about the important contributions that minorities have made. So, especially a colleague of mine, Dr. Tyrone Freeman, just wrote a book about Madam Walker, right? And he engages on how we, in fact, when we think about giving from a very specific spectrum. So I think that's one piece, is that, minorities traditionally have given a lot, we just don't give them a lot of credit. And so Muslim Americans are part of a long tradition of minorities giving more than what we expect them to do. So that's one. I think the other piece of it is that within the Muslim faith, there's this institutional pillar of philanthropy, which is really important. So and it's not something that's new, right? If you think about the work of Sylviane Diouf, she looked at enslaved women during times of slavery, where these enslaved women would collect their daily rations of rice, and every so often make these saraka cakes, bring all these children on the plantation, share those rice cakes. These kids would clap their hands, say Ameen, and share that. So there's this tradition of within the faith that sort of promotes generosity. So I think it's this two pieces. One, the fact that Muslim Americans happen to be largely people of color. They come from a long line of tradition of persecuted minorities that have had to do a lot. And I know Dr. Grewal has written a lot about this as well. And but those are two things that come to my mind.
And I'd like to get Dr. Grewal's comment on that. But before you jump in, I want to just remind everyone we're about to bring back Jonathan Menace back into the conversation, and we want to hear from you in the audience. So if you have questions or comments, please share them on your platforms and in your chat boxes, your comment boxes, and we are gathering those comments and questions, and we will share them with all of you in a few minutes. So did you want to say something?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's really a mixed bag. So, I mean, I have to say that for myself, many years ago, I gave a donation to an Iraqi orphanage, and then the organization that collected the donation came under the suspicion, of the government, and led to an FBI investigation. It made my own. I don't often talk about this in public, but it made my own life quite difficult during that period, and ultimately led to someone who I think was wrongfully arrested and is a political prisoner, which was Rafal Daher, but with Diana. But that's what I was trying to say, that these stories are so common. So we look at the history of Muslim giving, which has been, one of the real nodes in the war on terror, an incredible pressure point. I mean, the ways in which Muslim giving has been constrained in the last 20 years is shocking, especially when you compare with the enormous growth of Christian philanthropic organizations or NGOs or INGOs that have actually, gone from small scale operations to just massive budgets. I'm thinking here of like something like World Vision or Samaritan's Purse or some of these other organizations. Meanwhile, Muslim charities have just been almost snuffed out. So one of the things that happened in that, and my colleague Sally Howell has actually documented this. I mean, so like in a place like Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up, what happened is because Muslims were not able to give to the international causes that they used to give to, you had, something like 10 times the square footage added to Muslim schools, mosques, and other properties because they had to invest their money very, very locally. So that was certainly not the intention behind those war on terror policies. So we've had some, when we look at the picture, it's very complex. So it's always a picture of brutal repression. And then yet there are these moments of kind of hope and people are very creative and they find a way. But yeah, so I think that, there has been a lot of growth, but I would just, tell Sharik, my friend and colleague, yes, can you imagine what the last 20 years would have been like, would have been like if it wasn't for the war on terror, right? If we weren't living with these incredible constraints, where would we be?
That's just one more insidious example of the impact that the war on terror has had that may have been completely unanticipated. So yeah, I wanted to then bring back in Jonathan Maness if he's ready to join us, because I think he might want an opportunity to respond to some of the comments he's heard about the role of the legal system and how powerful and how much difference it can make. You have any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I find myself actually agreeing with everything that I've heard. So I think maybe I was reaching in my remarks to find the silver linings, because there are so many lawyers out there who are doing great work to defend people, individuals who find themselves, as you say, Professor Saeed, up against the wall, and the lawyers in court trying to make the best outcome for them. And sometimes the courts mitigate the power of the government when they're coming after a person. But more fundamentally, I think that you're absolutely right that what happens in court reflects what's going on in society. It doesn't drive social change typically, maybe once in a blue moon, but really it doesn't. It reflects. It reflects the social movements and the organizing and the changing narratives that happen outside the courts. I mean, this is the history of the civil rights movement in this country. I mean, lawyers like to take credit for all these great advances, but it wasn't the lawyers who won those cases in a fundamental way. It was the activists. It was the organizing, and that's surely going to be the story in this case too, with respect to the rights of Muslims in America, if we make progress. So I do think as Professor Saeed so eloquently said, that lawyers do have an opportunity in court to counter false narratives, to turn them back, to oppose falsehoods or the innuendo that government lawyers have often relied upon, to kind of expose the sort of Kafkaesque machinery that this national security apparatus has erected. I mean, I know from your work, I mean, you're familiar with this, like you think you've won a victory and then it's like, oh, the government's got another tool at its disposal and another and another and another. I talk about Mr. Hassoun's case of success, and he is a free man now, but it's also important to note that the government didn't concede anything. They were appealing our victory and would have kept him in detention for much longer if things had worked out a different way, or if they hadn't found a country to take him. So maybe I was reaching a little too hard for optimistic notes. But I do think that lawyers in the courts are sort of like an important backstop. But I agree that if we're looking to the courts as to be at the vanguard protecting rights, you're not going to find them there, except in a very rare case.
Thank you. We have several questions coming up here, so I'm going to put this one to each one of you. What do each of you want Americans and Muslim Americans to pay attention to? How can the average person make their greatest impact? Dr. Saeed, you want to try that one?
Well, I can try. I mean, I think I'll speak in as general a sense as possible, but I think the idea is, to my mind, that Muslims, like any other community in this country, like any other religious community, any other, any other racial or ethnic group, should insist on their rights being respected like any other citizen, like people of Northern European origin enjoy in this country. The idea that their rights, specifically in a lot of these cases, we're talking about First Amendment rights, because when we start talking about things like charitable giving that's religiously driven, there's a reason why the situation is the way it is, in the sense that the government went after the largest Muslim charity in the country. It didn't just shut it down, administratively. It also prosecuted the officers and obtained convictions in one of the greatest outrages of the sort of war on terror in court. This is the trial of the officers of the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development, and that was also related to Palestine as well. So there was that kind of double attack on just being a religious Muslim and charitable giving, and also giving to Palestine, to people in need in Palestine. And so I think it's the idea that groups insist that their rights, in this case First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, etc., and association, be respected the way that others are, and not be the subject of scrutiny as inherently suspect. And so I think that's one way to kind of, one thing that animates me and propels me in the work that I do in terms of trying to analyze these various cases, is to remember that it's about having, not treating people as lesser citizens or citizens with lesser rights.
Thank you. I'd like to go to Zarina, because she's chomping at the bit to answer this question about what ordinary Americans can do.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to take it in a different direction. I think we got a really lovely and very general answer to that question about what we need to do. I have actually a very specific recommendation, and that is, whether you have children or not, everyone, Muslims or Americans, every single person should be invested in the educational system in this country, which is right now is absolutely under attack. Maybe you've heard about this boogeyman called critical race theory. This is a very frightening moment. Join your school board, go to the meetings. I've been researching this. Minorities are always the canary in the mine. In places like Texas and Tennessee, you had a tiny fringe, just a couple of people who could basically cause a ruckus and get all of the Islamic material out of 7th grade textbooks and social studies, because they said, this is indoctrinating our children. Now it's can't learn about slavery, can't learn about any critical race theory. This notion that a tiny fringe movement that is very loud is actually destroying public education in this country is something that everyone should be extremely invested in, and you can make a major impact just by showing up, because there's not very many of them. So that is what I would say is, I think, the most urgent and easiest thing to do, even more than voting. Many of us voted yesterday. That's great, but this is actually something you're not going to get a sticker. You're not going to get calls on the phone to remind you, but you can have a huge impact in your local school by just showing up.
Running for school board, showing up at the school board meetings, yes. Pushing back.
Yes.
Thank you. Other panelists have thoughts about what ordinary people can do?
I think, being open-minded and educating yourself about people who are different from you is crucial. Finding ways to meet and learn about others, people who aren't like you. I mean, in the course of, in this country, there's been different eras. There's been different people who have been constitutional outsiders. At one point it was sort of the threat of like Italian anarchists who were seen as the real threat, and then there was the Red Scare in the 50s. I'm a Jewish person, and my ancestors were persecuted for that reason. And I think that learning from that history. I mean, we're all people, and the Muslim faith is a beautiful religion. Like the Christian faith and the Jewish faith and all the others in this country, and sort of coming to sort of appreciate that and learn about that in a way that makes a person just not prejudiced. I mean, our culture has been so kind of suffused with these suppositions and sort of like predispositions to suspect people just because they're Muslim, and it's I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to sort of reach out across communities and realize that we have sort of so much in common, really, so much more in common.
Thank you. Dr. Siddiqui, did you want to?
Yeah, in the late 90s through 2004, I worked for the Islamic Society of North America, and one of the things that I think is interesting is that the people that used to attack Muslims in the late 90s and even in that early period right after 9/11, many of them are now allies of the Muslim community. And I also think about the boxes that we as Muslims had to sort of contort ourselves prior to 9/11 and the boxes that we have to contort ourselves in to be acceptable now to our allies. This is problematic, right? I think so. The message that I would have to both sides, to Muslims, is let's stop contorting, right? I think it should be acceptable for us to be who we are, I mean, and so that's one piece. So Muslims have to be able to sort of aspire to be themselves and find beauty in the difference of who we are. There's no one Muslim American group, right? There's so many. We're a highly diverse group, so we need to find the beauty in our own diversity, and I think we need to do that. And I think when it comes to our allies, they should have fewer boxes for us, what is acceptable, what is not. They should be our allies because it is un-American for people that are different to be treated differently under our law, right? We're talking about legal. It should just not be acceptable. And sometimes, and as a former attorney, I represented people that I did not like, whose values I didn't share, but it was my responsibility for them to have the best legal representation. And that is an ideal that we should always sort of lift up. So there are Muslims that you won't like. There are Muslims that I don't like, right? There are many people that don't like me, so including my own home, right? But we have to find value in what we have, right? And so that's the piece. The thing that tires me 20 years later is this Islamophilia boxes that have been created that we have to fit in order for us to have allies to be represented in courts and in civil rights battles or in public advocacy. And I think it's racism from both the left and the right and in the center. And I think that's something that I would. It's far too easy to say that Islamophobia comes from the right. Islamophobia comes from the United States of America, left, right, and center, and I think it should stop.
Great point. There is beauty in diversity and power in diversity and coalitions in diversity, as we talked about earlier. So this kind of connects to this broader question about what has changed in 20 years, particularly around the legal issues, the legal landscape. And there have been a couple of references to this, but how has the legal landscape changed over the last 20 years since 9/11? And how do we address that change to bring about transformative change? What have been the fundamental changes in the legal system, and how do we either fight those or take advantage of those?
Could I hazard an answer here? So I think what we've heard is a relentless drumbeat of the government and outside groups, trumpeting this message that Islam is dangerous. And this predates 9/11, by the way. I'm sure some of you probably remember my father wrote a book called Covering Islam, and that came out in 1981, right? And if you just change the names and the dates, it would still be true today. Especially, and the subtitle of the book is How the Media and the Experts Determine What We Think About Islam, or something like that. And that book had a very profound effect on me. And it basically, what we've seen is the one of the few I think benefits of this relentless assault on the notion of Islam, 1 billion people, many different faiths, sects, etc., groups, backgrounds, this idea that it's a monolith, which is completely crazy, and is correlated to terrorism or a propensity to commit terrorism, has not worked out. Has not. There was no proof ever that was true, and these cases have proved it, right? I mean, the sheer number of cases that depended on informants to make up the plot and basically hand the so-called bomb to the guy and pressure him to pretend to pull the trigger type thing. The search for sleeper cells. Remember when we were all obsessed with sleeper cells? I mean, they never existed. So I think, despite the fact that the government now has this legal arsenal that it's amassed, who's it going to use it against? I mean, we've heard today from the panelists, right, and in the other talk and panel, this is a community of people who overwhelmingly want to be part of the United States. I mean, I would probably say I'm much more critical in my view of being part of the United States than a lot of what I've heard today. But that's the overwhelming sense of it, and because the government can't really point to this, I think you've seen a lot of their claims have been subject to more scrutiny, have been taken with a grain of salt, because it's coupled with this type of naked bias. And I think one of the reasons why you saw people in the streets for the travel ban, for example, is because it was so, you couldn't deny the bias. You couldn't deny that, and I think Americans have developed in the 200 plus years of this country, especially in the last decade, you've seen a great deal more understanding that this type of bias is completely unacceptable, this overt bias. And so at least we've made that step.
Thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, and I want to do a sort of a round robin with everyone to ask you to give the MLFA some marching orders. Not only the organization, but the community. What are the marching orders? What is the one thing that we need to leave this conversation and be prepared to do is to move forward on this crucial cause? And I'll start with you, Zarina. Now, you mentioned education and advocating around that, so maybe that's your one thing. But give me another thing.
Well, I would absolutely say that, yeah, being mindful that the fight against critical race theory is a fight against it's a fight against white supremacy. So if you think white supremacy is a problem, then that's your fight. But I would also say that, as Sharks pointed out, we have these grassroots organizations. I can't call myself an activist anymore because I'm, no longer out there in the streets, although I'm happy to join. The leaders, the grassroots organizations are doing the heavy lifting for the community, and they are working with tiny budgets, tiny resources. If you can, please support with your money, with your time, and just amplifying the projects, because these people are burning out, and we can't afford for the people that are doing that heavy lifting to burn out.
Jonathan Manis, what's your marching order?
Yeah, I guess I want to build on that. So I think, obviously providing legal defense to people who are targeted is crucial and essential work. But I think there's also, a real opportunity for lawyers to do what's sometimes known as movement lawyering or community lawyering, where the idea is to put yourself as a lawyer in spaces where activists are organizing and deciding what their goals are, and to and not to see yourself as a lawyer as like the leader, but to see like, well, what can I do here? Are there any tools that the law makes available that might be useful as a tactic or a strategy, or are there things I can do to defend these folks who are organizing? And I think that can be sort of a really productive way for lawyers to kind of bolster the movements that will actually, may end up changing the law through the process of like social development and social understanding. So I think that there are real opportunities for lawyers to do that kind of like engaged community lawyering, movement lawyering, in connection with the kinds of organizations that Professor Grayle was talking about.
Great, thank you. Sharik Siddiqui, what's your marching order?
I'd build upon what's been said. What I would say is research shows that if you have good volunteer management programs, you create meaningful leaders around your cause. So I think there are a lot of young people, my colleagues on this panel all have students that are hungry to be part of the fight, right? I think nonprofit organizations, specifically within this legal space, need to provide meaningful ways in which these young law students and young lawyers can engage in a healthy way. They're not burnt out. They get this opportunity. They get to live their passion of trying to make America better, make these organizations better, and at the end of the day, not feel used. And so what I would say is, for organizations like MLFA and so on, build really great, brilliant volunteer management programs for young law students and young lawyers, regardless of faith, who want to come in and be part of the fight. And I think if we do that, we amplify the work that we need to do, because we're going to have all these great, amazing future leaders that have been with us at the grassroots.
Thank you. And final word goes to Wadi Saeed.
I mean, I think my expertise is limited in terms of, I'm analyzing things that have already happened a lot of the time. But I would say I'm always heartened when I see groups of different, backgrounds, different faiths, different ethnicities, whatever it is, working together. And I think what we've seen is there's been common cause made between many groups, Muslim advocacy groups, Palestine advocacy groups, Black Lives Matter groups, etc., Native American groups, Latinx groups, etc. I think this was what was also discussed in the previous panel. But I really think that kind of cross-cultural solidarity is what is going to lead to all these breakthroughs, and that's what gives me hope. Because when I look at the law, sometimes I don't feel so hopeful.
Please, we started this conversation with hope, and we want to end it with hope. And I'm hopeful because of all of you and because of the powerful work and brilliance you're bringing to this issue. And as a journalist, as someone who's an observer and hopes to be a storyteller, you've given me a lot of great story ideas and grist for the mill to keep this conversation going for a long time. And I'm grateful to you for that. I'm sure that the MLFA is grateful to all of you for the important work and contributions you made today. And I'm also want to thank the audience for their questions and for being part of this conversation. And with that, I will turn it back to Arshia Ali Khan.
Thank you, everyone. I am amazingly overwhelmed with the amount of information, and we're going to unpack this over time. I'm just grateful that you have all been with us for over 2 hours having this amazing and important conversation. Thank you to John Powell, Jonathan Maines, to Mevish, to Yasmin, to Zara, to Wadi, to Zarina, and to Sharik, and to Laura. Thank you for being with us today and having this critical conversation. I'm going to let Hatham end us and kind of unpack this. And what I'd like to do is just very quickly take you through where MLFA has been at and where we are taking this organization. So I will walk us quickly through our strategic brief, and we'll go from there. Next, Lynette. We have talked a lot about crisis. We know that 9/11 was a crisis, a tragedy, and so has been the global pandemic. MLFA is no different to a lot of grassroots and nonprofit organizations, and actually after the global pandemic, businesses have all of us have been affected by COVID. We have lost loved ones. We have seen people fall ill. and things have changed not only for us here in the United States, but also through the world. We believe at MLFA, as I stated earlier, ours is not a caravan of despair, and it is our opportunity to take these challenges and move into transformation. And that is what we have done. And I hope today was an example of how that transformation is coming together. So what do we do? I'm going to go back quickly to our vision because we started off with talking about belonging and othering. As I joined MLFA at middle of 2018, we actually took a step back as an organization and we started to examine what have we been doing for the past 18 years, what has been working, what has not been working. And we took that opportunity as an organization to redefine our mission and our vision and look at our values. And so the vision of MLFA is actually an America where constitutional rights and liberties are upheld equally for all, regardless of ethnicity, religion, and cultural heritage. And today you saw the opening of this vision come to life, where we want to hear from everyone, and we no longer want to be afraid, and we no longer want to only be in the mosques. The mosques will always be an important part of who we are and where we're taking this organization. And I want to work with all of you. We want to work with all of you in the United States and around the globe to effectively make this change. I stated earlier that our mission is to advance equality and justice for American Muslim organizations and individuals by combating injustices done in the name of national security law. That is the lane we have chosen. As we did our analysis, as we spoke to our stakeholders, as we looked around to see what was happening, we recognized that we had become specialists in the national security space. We have invested millions and millions of dollars, as I stated earlier, and we want to continue to specialize and really take our mission forward to impact and to change. So what do? We provide pro bono and low bono legal representation in targeted federal, civil, and criminal proceedings. We provide individualized compliance to advance nonprofit organizations, which I'll address in just a few. And we provide education, legal with our partnerships, with our communities, so that we are protecting and educating our community as we are defending and also moving the narrative. Our strategic priorities for 2021 and 2023 are to strengthen and protect the Muslim nonprofit community, to prevent unwarranted indictment of American Muslim individuals and organizations, and to increase reach and affect impact litigation. In my own personal words, we are here to protect, we are here to defend, and we are here to educate and assess and continue to make relevant changes and relevant strides towards a collective vision, towards our collective vision for all of us. How do we do that? Today was a great example of thought leadership, and that's kind of central to our slide. We recognize as we were fighting our cases, we started off as a grassroots case funding organization. In 2014, we launched our boutique law firm, the Constitutional Law Center for Muslims in America, CLCMA. And with that, we started our defense litigation arm. In 2021, we launched a partnership with the Lilly School of Philanthropy and the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative and have developed something called the Ihsan Standard, which you will be hearing a lot about. This is our way of giving back and bringing best practice for nonprofits across our nation so that we can move to our own standard and not be reactive to the standards that are put upon us. You will hear a lot more. Our website, God willing, inshallah, will become a place of knowledge and a knowledge hub for all of you to interact on these important matters. I'd like to have our speakers presented, articles, and I want you to see what's happening in the space of national security. So why is it important? When COVID hit, all of us had to reevaluate and question, should we exist? Are we essential? Do these missions move forward? Do we, close doors and we focus somewhere else? But as I talked to many, many community leaders and our stakeholders, as stated, everyone kept reinforcing the Muslim Legal Fund of America must exist. The Muslim Legal Fund of America has a very important mandate, and we cannot lose sight or focus on what we need to do. we've talked today a lot about what 20 years has done since 9/11. A lot of Muslims like myself were operating in fear. I started off my opening with my own experiences, but those are just a few of what my brothers and sisters and our community has faced individually and collectively. So we know that as a community, we need to move ourselves from survival to thriving. And that is our mandate. We have remained steadfast as an organization. We have overcome our challenges, and we continue to respond with all of you and all of these voices together. And I'll end by just thanking all of you. You know, our ultimate goal with your partnership is to safeguard our communities, to build legal power for American Muslims, to give power back to the powerless, and to strengthen and empower American Muslim organizations. I am looking forward to getting to know many of you, our panelists and our distinguished speakers, and I'm going to pass it to Dr. Hathambasian to close us out. I want to thank you all for being with us here today, and I look forward again to everything to come.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. I want to thank all of our speakers that participated and took time to both celebrate and really to be with us in thinking through the difficult issues that the American Muslim community faces. I would like to take a few moments to thank our interim CEO, Arshia Ali Khan. She has stepped into the role, wearing multiple hats, leading the organization in this critical transition period. But also I'd like to really thank my board, our board of directors, Muwaffaq Nahas and Jamal Sulaiman, who also have dedicated time and effort. We are weekly engaged in this conversation. And I'd like to thank all the staff and the support that have made this symposium possible. Again, as a nonprofit, I would be remiss of not actually encouraging people. If you felt that MLFA is an organization that is deserving of your support, don't hold yourself back. We're always are welcoming individuals to support and contribute to this effort. We are totally dependent on your support, and the community has stepped all the way back from our first cases, which is from the Holy Land Foundation case that brought MLFA into fruition and into the work to the current period. We are dependent on your contribution, your support. We did listen to your comments and your feedback. We are looking at how we could serve the community. And in the initiatives that Arshia have highlighted to us in terms of strengthening and protecting the Muslim community, impact litigation, and also thought leadership. What I would like to say and what I would like to invite you is that we want you to partner with us. And in here, the invitation is not only to Muslim community, but to all communities that are impacted. I come from a long legacy and history of working with communities of color, the Black community, the Latino community, the Central American Solidarity Movement, the anti-apartheid movement, even worked on American Disabilities Act. And I do think that the time and the opportunity for us to build a new civil and human rights coalition that pushes back on the egregious violations that have been undertaken by the government under the rubric of the war on terror, which has become a terror war directed at Muslim communities first and foremost, but also communities of color in general. Professor Powell said earlier that people used immediately after 9/11, wanted to use the N-word toward Muslims. And I would like to really expand a little bit on this as I conclude. the work that I do specifically on the Islamophobia front, it actually came into focus during the campaign of former President Obama. At the time, he was being maligned and demonized as being a closet Muslim. And the attempt to defame him at that time actually originated in the Democratic leadership, thinking that they would possibly derail his chances. And then it was embraced by the Republicans. And that's where Islamophobia and demonization of Muslims were brought into the ballot box. I do feel then, and I still insist today, that people really wanted to use the N-word on Obama. They really were anti-Black. They did not want to see a Black president in the White House. And therefore, they used his Muslimness as a signpost for his Blackness. And it's interesting that the individuals that rallied for that Islamophobic sentiments ended up winning the White House in 2016, and then rolled in with their anti-Blackness, anti-Muslimness, anti-Latino discourse, anti-Asian, and now racism has overt racism have a new lease in life. So I do believe that we need a collective effort. We need a broad civil and human rights coalition that also is thinking locally as well as transnationally, because I am committed to issues of war abroad, to roll back the continued violation of Palestinian rights that seems to have unlimited oxygen given to it. I do believe that we need to roll back our military-industrial complex and all the expenditures that are being there. I do feel that the war on terror against Muslims rationalize the expansion of U.S. footprint, military footprint abroad, which also connects us domestically. I do believe that I do often recommend to my students and those who engage with me that maybe you should go and visit Martin Luther King Three Evils of Society speech, where he articulated then that the three evils of society are militarism, materialism, and racism. And it seems that these are the three that have reared their ugly head again. Not that they were ended in the 1960s civil rights movement, but at least they were pushed to the margin for a while. But now they are back at the center stage. And it takes all of us, all of our efforts. It takes our education to educate ourselves about the history and the past and to center it, to understand what have happened in order for us to actually bring about transformative change. So education, coalition building, also lawyering for the movement. As MLFA, we are committed to engaging with transformative legal work, both in terms of research, publication, and impact litigation. So I would like to thank all of you that have joined us. You have enriched us with your participation. You have enriched us with you joining this symposium. And I do look forward to meeting you both virtually, as seems to be the phenomena these days, but more importantly, in person. And I wish you and all your family the best. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.